The wind in the Arizona Territory had a language all its own, and in the late autumn of 1887, it spoke of endings. It was a dry, scouring wind that peeled the last vestiges of life from the brittle grasses and carried the fine red dust of the desert in a constant, stinging haze. It swept across the vast, lonely expanse of pinyon pine and juniper, howling through canyons of sun-baked rock until it slammed into the small, huddled collection of buildings that called itself Pinyon Ridge. The town seemed to crouch against the wind, its wooden bones groaning under the assault. Dust coated everything, a uniform shroud of terracotta that muted the world, settling on the canvas roof of the Mesa Mail stagecoach as it rattled to a halt. Inside, Marin Doyle clutched two things as if they were the only anchors in a hostile sea: a cloth satchel, its fabric worn smooth and thin by years of anxious hands, and a single sheet of paper, folded and refolded so many times the creases were as soft as cotton. The ink on the letter had faded to the color of a pale bruise, but the words were burned into her memory. My name is Colt Harrow. I require a housekeeper. The pay is fair. You will be safe. Each word was a plank in a raft, a promise of deliverance from a life that had offered her nothing but wreckage. Safe. That single word was a balm she'd never known, a destination she had only ever dreamed of. The coach door swung open with a shriek of tortured metal, and the driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of sour miles and too much sun, grunted without looking at her. End of the line. Pinyon Ridge. Marin gathered her skirts, the cheap calico stiff with dust, and descended the iron steps. Her boots hit the wooden platform of the way station with a hollow thud that seemed to echo in the profound silence of the town. The driver swung her satchel down from the roof, letting it drop into the dust with a contemptuous thud. He spat a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the parched earth. Pinyon Ridge, he rasped, his voice like gravel in a tin can, not speaking to her so much as to the vast, indifferent landscape. Ain't nothing here but wind, cactus, and folks looking to forget who they used to be, or who they still are. He climbed back onto his seat without another glance, cracked his whip over the weary heads of his team, and the stagecoach groaned away, leaving Marin alone in a cloud of its departing dust. When the red grit settled, she took in the town. It was less a town and more a suggestion of one. The main street was a wide, rutted track of dirt. To her left stood a blacksmith's shop, the rhythmic clang of a hammer on anvil the only sign of industry. Across the way, the bat-wing doors of the Juniper Saloon hung slightly askew, emitting a low murmur of male voices and the faint, sour smell of spilled whiskey. Further down, a small chapel with a tin roof glinted painfully in the afternoon sun, its cross leaning as if weary of its vigil. The sheriff's office had a sign that listed to one side, the painted letters flaking away. People moved with a slow, deliberate economy, as if conserving energy against the oppressive heat and the weight of their own secrets. And as she stood there, a lone woman in a travel-worn dress, she felt their eyes on her. It wasn't a welcoming curiosity, it was a sharp, appraising stare, the kind a butcher gives a side of beef. From the shadowed doorway of the mercantile, a woman paused, her gaze flicking from Marin's worn-out boots to the simple knot of her hair, tallying her worth and finding it wanting. Two men leaning against a post outside the saloon stopped their whittling, their eyes lingering on her form with a lazy, proprietary insolence. Every glance felt like a violation, stripping away her hopes and leaving her exposed and vulnerable on this desolate stage. She pulled her shawl tighter, a useless gesture against a chill that came not from the air, but from the cold scrutiny of strangers. The directions in the letter had been simple. My ranch is at the west edge of town. You will see the leaning water tower, following the dusty track. She walked past the last of the town's sad buildings. The landscape opened up, revealing a solitary homestead set against a backdrop of red rock mesas. It was a stark and lonely sight, a low-slung log house, its timber darkened by sun and time, sat beside a barn that seemed to sag in on itself. The water tower, just as the letter described, listed precariously to the south. The fence line was a testament to hardship. Some of the posts were scarred with the unmistakable pockmarks of bullets, while sections of newly strung barbed wire glinted in the sun, a fresh wound on the tired land. The place didn't feel like a home. It felt like a fortress, a last stand against a world that was determined to break in. As she hesitated at the crude wooden gate, the wide door of the barn slid open with a low groan. A man stepped out into the harsh sunlight, and the world seemed to shrink to encompass only him. He was tall, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his dusty blue work shirt. A dark, untrimmed beard shadowed a square jaw, but it was his eyes that caught her, holding her fast for a single, breathtaking second. They were the color of a storm-clouded sky, a deep and turbulent gray that held a universe of unspoken history. Then, as quickly as they had met hers, his gaze slid away, moving to a point somewhere over her shoulder, as if the act of looking directly at another person was a risk he could no longer afford. This had to be Colt Harrow. He did not speak. He wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his belt and moved towards her, his stride long and sure-footed. There was a coiled stillness about him, a sense of immense physical power held in careful reserve. He stopped a few feet from her and raised a hand, not in greeting, but in a short, sharp gesture that clearly meant, "Wait." His movements were precise, economical, the silent language of a man who had learned to make himself understood without a voice. Marin's heart hammered against her ribs. The silence was unnerving, a living thing that pressed in on her from all sides. She fumbled in her satchel, her fingers trembling as she retrieved the letter. She held it out to him, the paper fluttering in the incessant wind. I've come about the position," she said, her voice sounding small and thin in the vast emptiness. "The housekeeping job." The wind caught the letter, trying to tear it from her grasp. A malevolent gust that seemed determined to steal this last, fragile chance. Colt reached out, his calloused fingers closing over hers for a brief moment to steady the paper. His touch was rough, the skin of his palm a landscape of hard labor. Yet there was a surprising warmth to it. He took the letter and his gray eyes scanned the words, his expression unreadable. Just then, a small movement at the corner of the house caught Marin's eye. A little girl, no older than 5, peeked out from behind the log wall. She was a tiny thing with a tangle of dark hair and enormous, watchful eyes. In her arms, she clutched a cloth rabbit, its ears tattered and one button eye missing. The child looked from Colt to Marin, her small face a mask of solemn curiosity. Then, in a voice so soft it was barely more than a breath of air, she whispered a single, pleaful phrase. "Don't go." The words, so simple and yet so profoundly desperate, struck Marin with the force of a physical blow before she could process them. Another sound shattered the tense quiet. It was laughter loud, braying, and dripping with malice drifting down from the low ridge that overlooked the ranch. 3 riders sat on fine-looking horses, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. They were young men, dressed in clothes too clean for this dusty land, their face flushed with arrogance. They trotted their horses forward, their grins widening as they took in the scene below. "Well, looky here, boys," the lead rider shouted, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "The trap is sprung." Another one hooted with laughter. "Sent the letter clean to St. Louis. I heard looks like you finally got yourself a bride. Harrow, a mail-order mare for the mute." They whistled and jeered, their taunts echoing off the side of the barn. "Hope she don't mind a quiet husband." A wave of heat washed over Marin's face, a burning tide of humiliation so intense it made her dizzy. The letter, the job, the promise of safety. It was all a lie, a cruel, vicious prank designed to mock the silent man who stood before her and to drag her, a desperate stranger, into the center of their joke. She was a prop in their heartless theater. Her journey, her hopes, her last few dollars spent on a stagecoach ticket, all for their amusement. She felt the sting of tears behind her eyes, tears of rage and shame. She took a half-step back, ready to turn, to walk away from this whole cursed town and never look back. But then, a tiny hand slipped into hers. It was Ivy. The little girl had crept forward, her small fingers curling around Marin's, her body trembling slightly. She wasn't looking at Marin. Her terrified gaze was fixed on the cruel men on the ridge. That small, trusting grip changed everything. The fire of Marin's humiliation cooled, forged into something harder, something protective. This wasn't just about her pride anymore. It was about the frightened child whose hand she was holding. Colt Harrow had not moved. He stood like a statue carved from granite, his face impassive as the insults rained down. But Marin saw the muscle that jumped in his jaw, the slow clenching of his powerful fists at his sides. He did not look at the men on the ridge. His gaze was fixed on the letter in his hand. With a deliberate, almost unnervingly calm motion, he crumpled it into a tight ball. Then he turned to Marin. For the first time, he looked her directly in the eye, and the storm she had seen there before was now a raging tempest. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook and a stub of a pencil. Bracing the book against the barn wall, he wrote, his movements quick and decisive. He tore the page out and handed it to her. His handwriting was surprisingly neat, the letters strong and clear. I did not write the letter, but if you need a place, stay. Work kitchen, garden, watch Ivy, safe. The first light at Pinyon Ridge was not a gentle awakening. It was a sharp, silver incision on the eastern horizon, slicing through the deep purple dark and promising another day of relentless sun. Marin was awake before it, her body aching from a night spent on a thin straw pallet. The silence of the small house was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic breathing of Ivy, who was curled in a nest of blankets near the cold hearth. Then, the sounds of the ranch began, one by one. The distant, mournful call of a mourning dove, the metallic squeal of the well pump, and closer, the sound that would come to define her mornings, the low, resonant creak of the barn door sliding open on its track. It was Colt, beginning his day in the pre-dawn chill. Marin rose, her stockinged feet silent on the rough wooden floorboards. She moved to the dry sink, pouring a small amount of water from the bucket into the basin. The water was icy, stinging her skin, but it cut through the lingering fog of sleep. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her dress, and pinned up her hair with practiced efficiency. Her first task was the fire. The cast-iron stove was a cold black monolith in the corner of the kitchen. She laid the kindling dry pinyon twigs and shards of juniper just as her mother had taught her, adding larger pieces of split logs on top. When she struck the match, the sulphurous smell was sharp in the cool air, and the small flame caught eagerly, casting a flickering, unsteady light across the room. Just as the fire began to crackle, the kitchen door opened without a knock. Colt stood silhouetted against the pale dawn, a wooden yoke across his massive shoulders, from which hung two full, steaming buckets of water. Marin hadn't heard him approach. He moved with a spectral quietness, his heavy boots making almost no sound on the porch boards. He walked past her to the dry sink and, with a controlled strength that fascinated her, unhooked the buckets and set them down. There was no thud, no splash. He placed them as gently as if they were made of eggshells, the steam rising from them to wreathe his head in a temporary mist. His eyes, gray and watchful, flicked to the new fire, then to the coffee grinder she had found on the shelf. He gave a single, curt nod of acknowledgement and was gone, the door closing just as softly behind him. Marin let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She set about grinding the coffee, the rich, smoky aroma filling the kitchen, a comforting, civilized smell in this wild place. Soon, the percolator was burbling on the stove, and she was mixing flour and lard for biscuits. The familiar motions of her hands a comfort. A small sound made her turn. Ivy stood in the doorway to the small adjoining room, her bare feet peeking out from under a long cotton nightshirt. She was clutching her one-eyed rabbit, watching Marin with an unnerving, solemn intensity. "Good morning, Ivy," Marin said softly, keeping her voice light. "I'm making biscuits. Are you hungry?" The little girl didn't answer. She just watched. Marin turned back to her dough. Sensing the child's caution, she began to hum, a tuneless, quiet melody here and there. After a minute, she felt a presence at her elbow. Ivy had crept closer, her gaze fixed on Marin's floured hands as she kneaded the dough. "Can you help?" Marin asked, not looking at her directly. She dipped her hand into the flour sack and held it out. Ivy hesitated, then slowly, tentatively, dipped her own tiny hand into the white powder. She giggled, a small, rusty sound, as she smeared it on the worn fabric of her nightshirt, leaving a perfect, ghostly handprint. From that moment, Ivy became her shadow. She followed Marin everywhere. When Marin swept the dusty floors, Ivy followed with a small bundle of twigs, earnestly flicking at the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. When Marin went to the garden, a sad, parched square of earth, Ivy pointed out the 3 stubborn tomato plants that were still, miraculously, alive. That afternoon, while Colt was mending a harness on the porch, his back to the door, Marin found a small, damp patch of ash in the cold hearth from a previous fire. She took a blackened stick. "This is your name," Marin whispered. Kneeling on the stone, she carefully drew the 3 letters in the gray powder IVY. Ivy's eyes went wide. She pointed a small, grubby finger. "Me, yes, you, Ivy." Marin guided the child's hand, and together they traced the letters again and again, until the child's laughter became more confident, the rusty sound polishing itself bright, IVY. Colt's work on the harness had stopped. Marin could feel his stillness through the open door, the weight of his attention. He was listening. The house was barren, devoid of any personal touch. It was a place for survival. Not living. Marin, desperate to bring some small measure of order and softness to the rough logs and bare floors, found a stack of old shipping manifests in a drawer. She tore them into neat rectangles. With the same stub of pencil Colt used, she began to write. She taped a slip of paper to the water bucket, water. Another one on the door. She labeled the stove, the table, the chairs. It was a way to claim the space, to make it hers. But it was also for Ivy, a way to tether the child's new, halting words to the world around her. The next morning, she found Colt standing by the dry sink, looking at her label. He had his own piece of charcoal in his hand. He didn't look at her, but she watched as he carefully, beneath her wobbly water, drew a perfect, tiny sketch of a wave. He moved to the table, and next to her word, he drew a simple, sturdy, 4-legged table. It was his way of joining the lesson. A few days later, Ivy tried to copy the word for door, her small fingers producing a backward D and a lopsided R in the hearth. Marin found Colt there later, his large frame crouched low, his finger gently correcting the curve of the D in the ash. He was teaching, too, in his own silent way. The slips of paper became their lifeline. The silence in the house, once so heavy and oppressive, was now punctuated by the soft scratch of pencil on paper. It became a language of necessity, stripped of all artifice. Marin, kneading bread one afternoon, would pause, lick her pencil, and scrawl on a scrap, "Need more wood for stove." She'd leave it on the table, and an hour later, the wood box would be full. One morning, she woke to the smell of ozone, a sharp, metallic tang in the air that she had never smelled so strongly before. The sky was a strange, bruised yellow. She found Colt on the porch, staring at the western horizon. She wrote on his notebook, which he now left on a hook by the door, "Dust storm this evening." He took the pencil, his large, calloused hand dwarfing it. He didn't write. He simply turned the notebook over and drew a rapid, angry swirl of lines, then an arrow pointing to the house, and finally, a sketch of the southern fence line with several posts clearly broken. The south fence is weak. He was already gathering his tools, his movements economical and swift. The storm was coming, and he had work to do before it hit. The midday sun was a physical weight, a white-hot knife that stabbed at the earth. Marin, hanging laundry on the line, felt her skin prickle and burn within minutes. She watched Colt working on the south fence, his back a rigid line of defiance against the heat. There was no shade. When he came in for the midday meal, She saw how the sun had scorched the back of his neck. After he left, she took a spare canvas tarp from the lean-to and 2 long poles. She spent the next hour struggling, her arms aching, trying to rig some kind of awning over the small porch. The wind kept catching it, nearly sending her tumbling. She heard a sigh of exasperation, a sound that was not quite a sound, more a sharp exhalation of breath. Colt was beside her. He took the canvas from her hands. He didn't scold her. He simply showed her. With a few deft movements, he retied the ropes, used the angle of the house as an anchor, and in less than 5 minutes, he had erected a sturdy, taut sunshade that created a patch of deep, cool shadow on the porch. He understood the wind, the sun, and the angles. He was a man who, Marin realized, read the world in smells and textures, not just words. He tipped his hat to her, a small, formal acknowledgement, and went back to his fence. That afternoon, Marin sat in the new shade, a basket of mending in her lap. She picked up one of Colt's work shirts. It was stiff with dried sweat and dust. The blue fabric faded to near white across the shoulders. A long tear ran down the sleeve. As she began to sew, her fingers methodical, she noticed another, older mark. It was near the collar, a puckered, angry-looking scar in the fabric itself, a place where the cotton had been seared, the edges melted and hard. She ran her thumb over it, confused. It looked like a burn. She found another on his other shirt. Later, when he came in to wash for supper, he unbuttoned his collar and rolled up his sleeves at the dry sink. Marin, stirring a pot of bean stew, glanced over, and she saw it. It was not a single scar. It was a perfect, pale and ravaged circle etched into the skin of his throat, just above his collarbone. It was the precise size and shape of an iron ring, a brand, a manacle. It was a mark of deliberate, agonizing cruelty. The skin was slick and shiny, devoid of hair, a testament to a fire so hot it had burned away his voice, his past, and his trust. Marin's breath caught in her chest. A wave of nausea, cold and acidic, rose in her throat. She gripped the wooden spoon so tightly her knuckles turned white. This was the reason. This was the silent, screaming explanation for the man who moved like a ghost, who placed buckets down without a sound, who had forgotten, or been forced to forget, how to speak. He must have felt her eyes. He turned, his face and hands still dripping, and their gazes locked. Moaned couldn't hide the shock and horror on her face. His expression, which had been one of simple, weary relief from the day's heat, shut down. The light in his gray eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, flat emptiness. He turned his back to her, quickly buttoned his collar all the way to his chin, and walked out of the house. Night fell. The sounds of the desert returned, the insistent, sawing rhythm of the crickets, the distant, lonely yip of a coyote. Ivy was asleep, a small, warm bundle on her pallet, her chest rising and falling in the soft glow from the fire. Marin sat at the table, her mending forgotten in her lap. The stew was untouched. Colt came back in, his face set like stone. He moved to the hearth and added a fresh log to the fire. The new wood hissed and popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The flames leaped, casting his shadow, large and distorted, against the log wall. The light played across Marin's face, catching the sheen of unshed tears on her cheeks. Their eyes met again in the flickering light. A brief, accidental collision. This time, they both looked away instantly, as if they had touched something hot. Marin couldn't bear the weight of the new, terrible silence between them. She tore a fresh scrap of paper from the stack. Her hand was shaking, but she forced the pencil to move. "Thank you for the sunshade." She slid it across the table. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked up his own pencil. He didn't write a word. He simply drew a small, horizontal line with a tiny, upward curve at each end. It was the barest, most awkward suggestion of a smile. It was the first time she had seen any hint of softness, of clumsy, gentle tenderness in him. It was a crack in the granite, a sign that the man was still in there, buried beneath the scar and the silence. Just as a small, fragile warmth began to settle in her chest, a new sound cut through the crickets. Hoofbeats, far off but distinct. Not a lone rider, but several, moving along the western ridge, the one that overlooked the ranch. Marin's breath hitched. She looked at Colt. He was already on his feet, his head tilted, listening. His eyes were no longer soft. They were sharp and cold, the color of wet steel. He walked to the window and stared out into the darkness. A silent guardian. The riders she knew, they both knew. It was Reeve and his friends were out there, circling like coyotes, unseen but felt. The peace of their small, quiet evening was a fraud, a thin piece of cloth that could be torn apart at any moment. Marin stood up. She went to the wood box by the door and began to gather logs, stacking them neatly by the hearth, her movements sudden and jerky. If they were to be watched, she would not be cold. Colt turned from the window. He picked up his tools and walked to the kitchen door, which Marin had noticed earlier had a loose latch. He began to work, his movements economical, securing the entrance to their small, fragile home. As he worked, he kept glancing up, not at her, but past her, toward the dark western ridge. Marin stopped her work and watched him. His silence was no longer empty. It was not the cold, vacant silence of the morning. It was a different thing entirely. It was the tight, charged silence of a coiled spring, of a man on watch. It was the silence of a promise safe. They ate the bean stew and cornbread late. In the quiet, charged atmosphere, Ivy, who had woken briefly, was telling a rambling, sleepy story about a kestrel she had seen, her words slurring together. Marin found herself laughing. A short, sharp sound of genuine amusement. The sound surprised her. She looked at Colt. He was watching them, a piece of cornbread halfway to his mouth. His gaze was fixed on Marin and Ivy, a look of such profound, naked longing that it made her own throat ache. As he watched them, the child's innocent chatter, the woman's unexpected laughter, the muscles in his scarred throat gave a sudden, sharp jerk, a reflexive spasm, as if his body was trying, against all hope and all history, to make a sound of its own. A life lived on the edge required a constant flow of supplies. The flour sack was nearly empty. The coffee tin held only dust. And Ivy needed a sturdier pair of shoes. The trip to Pinon Ridge was inevitable. Marin had dreaded it. The ranch, for all its darkness, had become a sanctuary. Its silence, once unnerving, was now a shared language. The town, however, was a different kind of quiet, a watchful, judging quiet that pricked at her skin. Colt drove the buckboard, his broad back straight, his eyes constantly scanning the ridges. Marin sat beside him, with Ivy wedged between them, clutching her cloth rabbit. The child was silent, absorbing the tension that radiated from the two adults. When they reached the main street, Colt pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the mercantile. He didn't get down. He simply made a small gesture with his hand toward the store, his message clear. Get what we need. I will wait. He was a guardian, but also an exile. He would not enter the town that had made him its sport. Marin lifted Ivy down, and the little girl's hand immediately found hers, gripping it tightly. As Marin walked across the dusty boardwalk, she felt the stairs. They were heavier this time. She was no longer just a new, stray woman. She was Harrow's woman. The eyes of the men whittling on the saloon porch followed her, their lazy appraisal now mixed with a knowing, mocking curiosity. From inside the blacksmith's, the hammer fell silent for a beat too long. As she pushed open the mercantile door, the bell jangled, announcing her arrival to the cool, dim interior. The air smelled of pickle brine, bolts of calico, and dry tobacco. "Mornin'," a woman said from behind the counter. She was Mrs. Henderson, a small, bird-like woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson. I need flour, coffee, and a small pair of boots, if you have them." "Got the flour and coffee. Boots is in the back, Mrs." Henderson began scooping flour into a sack, her movements brisk. "You're staying out at the Harrow place. Then," it wasn't a question. I'm the housekeeper, Mrs." Henderson tied off the sack with a sharp tug. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, though there was no one else in the store. "You be careful, girl. That place, it ain't right. Hasn't been for a long time." "What do you mean?" Marin asked, her voice quiet. The woman's sharp eyes darted to the sunlit doorway, as if to make sure Colt wasn't listening. "It's cursed. That's what. Been cursed ever since. Well, ever since her, the Navajo woman." "Mrs." Henderson hissed, the words themselves tasting like scandal. Oh, it was years ago, before the fire that took his voice. He was different then. Talked, even smiled. They say he brought her here, lived with her, right out in that house, like it was nothing, like it was right. She spat the word. The town don't forget a thing like that. Pride, that's what it was. And pride gets punished, one way or another. The land's cursed, girl, and nothing good will ever grow on it. A cold dread settled in Marin's stomach. This was the source of the town's venom. Not just a prank, but a long simmering resentment, a judgment passed down years ago. As Marin paid for her goods, trading the eggs she'd brought, she heard a low snort from the front porch. A man, waiting for the saloon to open, looked her up and down. "That's another stray bird roosting in the crow's nest," he muttered to his companion, just loud enough for her to hear. Marin's face flushed. She gathered her sacks, her hands trembling slightly, and took Ivy's hand again. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson." She pushed open the door and stepped back into the blinding sun, the bell jangling her exit. She was halfway to the wagon when a man stepped directly into her path. He was tall and wore a clean duster, unusual in this dusty town. A silver concho band was wrapped around his hat, and the badge pinned to his vest was polished to a high shine. This was Sheriff Gabe Murdoch. His eyes, however, were not clean. They were muddy, opaque, and they fixed on Marin with a look that was both assessing and proprietary. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was smooth, like oil. "You'd be the new help out at the Harrow Ranch?" "Yes, Sheriff." "I'm Marin Doyle, Gabe Murdoch." He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just a friendly word of welcome to Pinyon Ridge. A woman like you, a man like Harrow. Folks talk. I'm there to work." "Sheriff." "Of course you are." His gaze drifted from her face, down the line of her throat, and back up. "You just watch yourself around that land, especially the water." Marin tensed. The water. That's right, the south ditch that feeds his property. It runs off the main channel, and that channel belongs to the Hickory Ditch Company. They get particular about who's drawing what. Wouldn't want to see a misunderstanding. His eyes held hers, and the message was perfectly clear. This was not a friendly warning. It was a threat, wrapped in the thin cloth of the law. From the wagon, Marin heard a sharp thud. Colt had placed his hand flat on the sideboard, a small, contained movement that was nonetheless charged with impatience. Murdoch's gaze flicked to Colt. He gave a slow, unpleasant smile. "You have a fine day, Miss Doyle." He tipped his hat again and sauntered away, his spurs ringing with authority. Marin hurried to the wagon and loaded the supplies. As Colt turned the buckboard around, Marin overheard two men talking as they slipped into the Juniper Saloon. "Rusk family's got the ditch company in their pocket now," one said. "They're buying up every water right south of the mesa. Gonna choke Harrow out proper." The other replied with a dry chuckle. "He won't sell. They'll just turn off the spigot. That land ain't worth a damn without the creek." Marin's blood ran cold. Reeve, Pax, Lorne, the laughing boys on the ridge, the Rusk family. It all clicked into place. The prank, the taunts, the sheriff's oily warning, the rumors of the Hickory Ditch Company. This was a siege, a slow, methodical, economic war to drive Colt Harrow off the land he refused to sell. And she had just walked into the middle of it. The ride back was silent, but the air in the wagon crackled. Marin looked at Colt's rigid profile, the hard line of his jaw. He knew, of course he knew. He lived with this shadow every day. That evening, after Ivy was asleep, Marin felt a restless energy she couldn't name, The house felt smaller, the walls closing in. She needed to understand. She thought of the small, square hatch in the ceiling of the main room, leading to a low attic. Taking a lantern, she pulled the rickety ladder down and climbed up into the hot, close darkness. The attic was filled with the ghosts of a former life. Dust lay thick as velvet over everything. Stacked boxes, a broken chair, a cradle coated in cobwebs. In the far corner sat a large, flat-topped wooden chest. It wasn't locked. She lifted the heavy lid. The smell of dry paper and cedar rose to meet her. Inside, it was not clothes or keepsakes, but Colt's mind, laid bare. It was filled with maps, all drawn by his hand on aging parchment. Maps of the ranch, maps of the territory. But they all centered on one thing, water. She saw the hand-drawn lines of the main canal and the smaller artery labeled Hickory Ditch South Feed. He had marked every juncture, every gate. Tucked beneath the maps was a ledger book. It wasn't for money. It was a water log. Dates, flow levels, rainfall, all recorded in his neat, strong pencil script. And then, on the very last page, she saw a short, stark note, written as if in a moment of desperation. Water = life. No water = cell. This was the heart of the fight. This was his vulnerability. The land was his anchor, but the water was its blood, and his enemies were standing on the vein. Beneath the ledger, at the very bottom of the chest, was something else. It was a single sheet of good drawing paper, a sketch done in charcoal, with a skill that startled her. It was the woman. She knew it instantly. The face from Mrs. Henderson's gossip. She had thick dark hair that fell in a loose braid over one shoulder. She was not beautiful in the way of the painted women in East Coast magazines. Her beauty was in the strength of her jaw, the high line of her cheekbones, and her mouth, which was caught in a wide, unreserved, joyful laugh. Her eyes were crinkling at the corners. She was leaning against a cypress tree, her head tilted back, basking in a sun that Maren could almost feel. Maren traced the line of the woman's cheek with her finger. The charcoal was smooth, sealed by time. She felt the power of it, the sheer, undeniable love that had guided the artist's hand. This was the woman Colt had loved. This was the woman the town had hated. This was the curse. And Maren felt nothing, no jealousy, no sense of rivalry with this vibrant ghost. What she felt was a profound, hollowing sadness. This joy, this laughter, this light, it had been extinguished. It explained the vast, echoing emptiness she had felt in the house when she first arrived. It wasn't just silent. It was a home that had its heart torn out. The fire that had taken Colt's voice had also taken this. She gently placed the drawing back, closed the chest, and climbed down. The weight of Colt's past settling on her shoulders alongside the weight of his present danger. The next afternoon, she looked out the kitchen window and saw Colt in the yard with Ivy. He was crouched in the dust, a stick in his hand. Ivy was beside him, mimicking his posture. He was pointing up at the sky, at the thin, wispy clouds streaming high above. Maren watched as he drew a shape in the dirt, a long, feathery plume. Ivy clapped. Then he pointed to the drawing and then back to the sky. Mares' tails, Maren thought, remembering her father teaching her. Wind to follow. Then he drew a different pattern. A rippling, scaly look, mackerel sky, storm's on its way. Ivy took the stick, her small hand serious, and tried to copy his drawing. Colt watched her, his expression unreadable, but when she finished her lopsided scrawl, he reached out and ruffled her tangled hair. Maren smiled. His silence was not a void. It was a school. He was teaching the child to read the world, to see the signs, to listen with her eyes. It was a lesson in survival, offered with a gentleness that made Maren's throat tighten. On Sunday, a new visitor arrived. Reverend Pike, the town's spiritual shepherd, rode up on a neat-looking mule. He dismounted, holding his hat in his hands. Maren met him on the porch. Colt, who had been repairing a harness, stopped his work, his hands still, his presence a heavy weight in the background. "Miss Doyle," the Reverend said. He was a thin man with a perpetually worried expression. "I came by as a courtesy, to welcome you to our small community, and to see to the state of the house. That's kind of you. Reverend, can I offer you some water? No? Thank you, child. His eyes strayed past her, into the dim interior of the house, then to Colt, who was watching him, motionless. I only mean to say that a house needs a proper foundation, a blessing. Especially a house with a child. A child needs stability. A proper arrangement. The implication hung in the dry air. He was asking, in his roundabout way, what she was doing here. Was she a servant, or was she a sin? Marin stiffened. Ivy is well cared for. Reverend, and Mr. Harrow has been a respectful employer. Of course, Pike said quickly, flustered by her directness. I only meant... He was interrupted by the sound of bootsteps. Colt moved from the shadows of the lean-to onto the porch. He didn't look at the Reverend. He walked directly to the chair where Marin had been sitting moments before. He stopped beside it, and in a gesture of profound and unmistakable meaning, he placed his large, calloused hand on the high wooden back of her chair. It was not a touch, not a caress. It was a claim. It was an anchor. It was a silent, unassailable answer. She belongs here. This is my house. This is my choice. Reverend Pike's eyes widened. He saw the gesture for what it was. He licked his lips, his spiritual authority evaporating in the face of such quiet defiance. Well, he stammered, backing toward his mule. God be with you, then. Good day, Miss Doyle, Mr. Harrow. Colt didn't move until the Reverend was halfway down the track. Marin let out a shaking breath. A small battle had been won, without a single word. The real attack came that night. Marin had woken, thirsty. She was padding barefoot to the kitchen when she heard it. A sharp thwack against the fence, followed instantly by the bright, tinkling shatter of glass. Then, a whoosh of liquid flame. Colt, she screamed, her voice tearing the dark. She grabbed the full water bucket from the dry sink, ignoring the cold that splashed onto her feet, and ran out onto the porch. One of the new fence posts near the gate was engulfed in orange flames, the fire climbing fast, licking at the dry wood. The acrid smell of kerosene choked the air. She threw the water. The flames hissed, sputtered, and died in a cloud of stinging smoke. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, echoing the quick, percussive beat of the dying fire. In the sudden silence, she heard a sound behind her. Colt was there, materializing from the darkness of the barn. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring into the night, a rifle held low and ready at his side. The attackers were gone, their cowardly work done. Marin stepped closer to the smoldering post, her bare feet sinking into the cool dust. The water dripped from the blackened wood. As her eyes adjusted, she saw it, carved deep into the wood before it was set on fire, now charred and ugly, was a single, deep-cut letter. R for Rusk, R for Reeve, R for Ruin. She stood there, trembling, the empty bucket hanging from her hand. This was the answer to their small victories. This was the town's reply. They went back inside. Colt lit the lantern. The small kitchen was filled with a terrible humming tension. Colt's anger was a cold, dangerous thing, radiating from him in waves. He checked his rifle, his movements dangerously precise. Marin was shaking, but not just with fear. A cold, hard anger was settling inside her. This was her home now. They had attacked her home. She walked to the small slate hanging by the stove, the one they used for grocery lists. She picked up the chalk. Her hand was steady. She wiped the slate clean and, in letters that were clear and strong, she wrote 2 words, "Don't sell." She turned and held it up. Colt stopped his movements, his gaze fixed on the slate. The kitchen was deathly quiet. He walked over to her, his eyes never leaving the words. He took the slate from her, his grip so tight his knuckles were white. He stared at it for a long, agonizing minute, as if the words were the only 2 solid things left in the world. Then, he lifted his gaze to hers. His eyes were raw, filled with the fire he had seen outside and the old fire that lived inside him. Very slowly. He nodded. It was a declaration of war. A fragile alliance of two broken people and one small child, forged in the light of a kerosene fire. Marin looked out the dark window. She knew this was only the beginning. Pinion Ridge was a town that knew how to crush new things. The day the sky broke began with a lie. The morning dawned clear and deceptively calm. A pale blue bowl scrubbed clean of clouds, but by midday, the lie began to unravel. A strange, unnatural stillness fell over the ranch, the kind of profound quiet that precedes violence. The air grew heavy, thick and difficult to draw into the lungs, and it carried a sharp, metallic smell, the scent of ozone, of electricity waiting to be unleashed. Colt was the first to feel it. Marin saw him from the kitchen window, where he'd been replacing a rotted board on the porch. He stopped mid-hammer swing, his head lifting. He stood motionless for a full minute, a predator scenting danger on the wind. Then he walked to the edge of the porch, his gaze fixed on the western horizon. Marin followed his gaze. The skyline was no longer a clean line. It was smudged, then bruised, a deep and angry purple that was bleeding upwards into the blue. High above, thin, feathery clouds, the mare's tails he had drawn for Ivy in the dust, were being ripped apart by an unseen celestial fury. Colt turned, and his eyes met Marin's through the window. There was no time for notes, no need for words. His urgency was a physical force. He jabbed a single, commanding finger toward the west, then made a sharp, gathering motion with his hands, as if pulling in a rope. His meaning was terrifyingly clear. The herd. His small herd of hardy longhorns was grazing down in Hell Rock Wash, the deep, narrow arroyo where a trickle of a creek provided the only water for miles. An arroyo that would, in the face of a desert squall, become a death trap. Marin didn't hesitate. She untied her apron, her hands moving with a speed that surprised her. This was not a choice. It was a necessity. The herd was their livelihood, the fragile barrier between survival and starvation. "Ivy," she called, her voice sharp with an urgency the child had never heard before. Ivy came running, her small face clouded with confusion. Marin knelt, taking the little girl by her thin shoulders. "Ivy, a big storm is coming, a very big one. Colt and I have to go get the cows. I need you to be a very brave girl and stay inside." Tears welled in the child's eyes. "No, I want to come. You can't, little one. It's not safe, but I will make you a promise." Marin took Ivy's small hand. "You stay here, and you lock the door behind us, and you count all the way to 100, very slowly. And then you start over, and you keep counting until we come home. Can you do that for me? Can you be my brave counter?" Ivy's lower lip trembled, but she looked at the grim set of Marin's jaw, at the looming, bruised sky outside, and she nodded. A small, jerky motion. "I'll count." Marin threw on a heavy canvas coat, the one Colt had left for her on that first day, and ruthlessly tied her hair back in a tight knot at the nape of her neck. By the time she stepped outside, Colt had their horses saddled. He threw her up onto the mare's back with an effortless strength that stole her breath, then swung onto his own stallion. He pointed to the house, then made a locking motion with his hand. Marin nodded. She watched as Ivy's small face appeared in the window, her hand pressed against the glass. The bolt on the inside of the door slid home with a heavy, final-sounding thunk. A small, safe box in the face of the coming chaos. They rode hard, the horses' hooves drumming a frantic rhythm against the dry, packed earth. The wind was a physical thing now, a solid wall they had to push through. It tore at Marin's coat, whipped stray strands of hair across her face like tiny lashes, and filled the air with a low, mournful howl. The sky was a churning cauldron of black and purple. There was no thunder yet, just a constant, ominous rumble that seemed to vibrate up from the ground itself. They reached the lip of Hell Rock Wash and pulled their horses to a halt. Below them, the small herd was clustered near the creek bed, their heads down, already sensing the shift in the world. They looked small and terribly vulnerable. Colt gave her a sharp, quick look, then pointed. Him to the far end of the wash to drive them out, her to stay at the mouth. to turn them up the trail toward home. She understood. She was the gate. He spurred his horse down the steep, rocky incline. Just as he reached the floor of the arroyo, the world broke. There was a deafening crack, as if the sky itself had split in two, and a bolt of white-hot lightning seared a jagged path from the clouds to a distant mesa. The thunder that followed was not a rumble. It was a physical concussion, a blast that shook the very rock beneath them. And with it came the rain. It was not rain. It was a solid, falling sheet of water, thick and gray and cold. It hit the parched ground with the force of 1,000 hammers, instantly turning the dust to a thick, clinging mud. Visibility dropped to a few yards. The howling of the wind was joined by the roar of the downpour. The cattle panicked. They scattered, their terrified bellows swallowed by the storm. Marin watched through the blinding rain as Colt, a lone, determined figure, rode into the chaos, his lariat a blur as he wheeled his horse back and forth, trying to force the terrified animals into a single, controllable group. Marin held her position, her horse shifting nervously beneath her, the rain plastering her hair to her skull and running in cold rivulets down her back. She wrapped the end of her lariat around her saddle horn, ready. Then she heard a new sound, beneath the roar of the rain, a deeper, angrier roar. She looked up the wash, and her heart seized in her chest. A wall of brown, churning water was coming. A flash flood. It wasn't just rising. It was a moving, living thing. A predator of mud and rock and uprooted creosote bushes. And it was thundering down the narrow canyon directly at the herd. Colt, she screamed, but her voice was ripped away by the wind. He had seen it too. He rode with a desperate fury, pushing the last of the terrified longhorns toward the escape trail. They were almost clear when Marin saw it. A small, spindly-legged calf, separated from its mother, had stumbled, its back leg hopelessly tangled in the thorny, grasping arms of a yucca plant near the canyon wall. It bawled in terror, pulling against the plant as the brown water surged around its hooves. Colt didn't hesitate. He spurred his horse directly into the path of the rising water, leaping from the saddle while the animal was still moving. He landed in the knee-deep, churning mud and water, fighting the current that clawed at his legs. The mother cow, seeing her calf, tried to turn back, her horns tossing wildly. The rest of the herd, caught between the instinct to flee and the pull of the cow, began to mill in confusion at the mouth of the trail, threatening to stampede back into the wash. Colt was struggling with the yucca, his knife a flash of silver as he sawed at the thick, fibrous leaves. The water was at his waist now, pulling at him, trying to drag him under. Marin knew what she had to do. She couldn't leave her post. She was the gate. She took her lariat, swung it once, twice, and sent the loop flying. It landed perfectly around the saddle horn of Colt's horse, which was standing its ground, a rock in the churning water. Marin pulled her own horse back, digging in her heels. The rope snapped taut between them. She wrapped the lariat around her own saddle horn, her knuckles white. Here she screamed, a raw, desperate cry of pure will against the storm. I have him. I have the horse. Colt turned his head. Through the sheeting rain, their eyes met. His were dark, intense, filled with the fury of the fight. He saw the taut rope. He saw her, braced against the storm. He saw that she would not let go. For a single, critical second, he trusted her. He turned his back on his horse, on his only means of escape, and focused entirely on the calf. The current was a physical monster now, dragging at them. Marin felt the strain in her arms, in her back, a burning fire that spread through her muscles. Her horse grunted, its hooves slipping in the slick, red mud. They were being pulled back, inch by agonizing inch, toward the raging heart of the flood. She held on, her teeth gritted, her entire world narrowed to that single, vibrating line of rope. With a final, desperate heave, Colt ripped the calf free. He threw the small, trembling animal over his shoulder and fought his way back to his horse, the water now at his chest. He threw the calf onto the saddle, then grabbed the horn and hauled himself up. He looked at Marin and gave a sharp, downward chop with his free hand. Slack. She unwrapped the rope, her fingers numb and clumsy. Colt's horse, free of the anchor, scrambled up the last few feet of the muddy bank, but the danger wasn't over. The rest of the herd was still a panicked, dangerous knot of horns and hooves. Colt, holding the calf with one arm, pointed with his other at the milling animals, then swept his hand in a wide arc. Drive them, Marin understood. She unwound her lariat, using the weighted end as a whip. She spurred her horse forward, screaming, her voice raw, riding at the flank of the herd, turning them, pushing them. She and Colt worked as one, a silent, perfectly coordinated team in the heart of the storm. He on one side, she on the other. They drove the terrified animals up the trail, out of the roaring mouth of Hell Rock Wash and onto the relative safety of the high ground. They didn't stop. They pushed the herd relentlessly toward home, the rain still coming down in blinding sheets. They were halfway back when they reached the small wooden bridge that crossed a normally dry creek bed. It was no longer dry. A raging torrent of brown water poured through it, and the bridge itself was gone, smashed to kindling by the force of the flood. There was a 10-foot gap of churning water between them and the other side. Colt brought his horse to a halt. He slid from the saddle, still holding the calf, and set it on the ground. It immediately ran to its mother. He turned to Marin. He gestured for her to dismount. Then he pointed to the other side. He took a few steps back, then ran, launching himself into the air. He landed on the far bank, his boots sinking into the soft, muddy earth. He turned and held out his hand. Marin stared at the gap. The water roared below. It looked impossibly wide. She looked at his outstretched hand. It was steady. His eyes held hers, commanding, reassuring. She took a breath, backed up, and ran. She threw herself across the gap, her eyes fixed on his hand. Her fingers found his just as her feet slipped on the muddy bank. His grip was like iron. For a second, she dangled, the water clawing at her boots. Then he pulled, his muscles cording, and hauled her up onto solid ground. His hand was wrapped so tightly around hers that she could feel the frantic, powerful beat of his own pulse, a steady, living rhythm against her skin. They left the horses and the herd, knowing they would find their own way back to the barn. They stumbled the rest of the way on foot, slogging through the mud, their bodies screaming with exhaustion. They half collapsed onto the porch of the small log house, the rain drumming a wild tattoo on the roof above them. The world was a blur of gray water and brown mud. Colt shouldered the door open, and they fell inside, into the relative quiet and warmth. Marin leaned against the wall, her chest heaving, her clothes soaked, her body trembling with cold and adrenaline. She looked at Colt. He was covered in mud, his hair plastered to his forehead, his face grim with exhaustion. And then a strange, bubbling sound escaped her lips. It was a laugh, a wild, hysterical, breathless laugh, born of terror and relief and the sheer, impossible fact that they were alive. Colt looked at her, his storm-gray eyes wide, and then the corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, not really, but it was the promise of one. The door, which had been left unlatched, was pushed open. Ivy stood there, her small face pale, her eyes enormous. She had a half-eaten biscuit in one hand. She must have stopped counting. She looked at the two mud-caked, dripping, exhausted figures, and her face crumpled. "You came back," she whispered. She launched herself at them, wrapping her arms around Marin's wet legs. Marin slid down the wall to her knees, pulling the child into a fierce, trembling hug. She pressed her forehead against Ivy's, closing her eyes. "We came back, little one," she whispered. Her voice choked. "Everything's all right now." That night, the storm passed. The rain softened to a gentle, rhythmic drumming on the roof. The house was filled with the smell of drying wool and brewing coffee. Ivy was asleep, tucked securely in her bed. Marin sat at the kitchen table, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the last of the embers glow in the stove. She was tired, but it was a good tiredness, a deep-in-the-bones satisfaction. She took a piece of paper and a pencil. Her hand ached, but she wrote carefully, "Tomorrow fix the bridge." She paused, then added, "And thank you for trusting me." She left the note on the table where he would see it. She rose to go to her bed, but stopped as Colt entered the kitchen. He had seen the note. He picked up the pencil. His hand was steady. Beneath her words, he wrote a single line. He didn't add a drawing or a symbol, just one word, written in his strong, clear script. Trust. It was a word as short as a heartbeat, and as wide as the prairie after a storm. The storm scoured the world clean. In its wake, the air turned sharp and cold, carrying the clean, biting scent of wet pine and damp earth. The sun, when it returned, was a pale, watery disk, offering light but little warmth. The shared ordeal of the flood had changed the silence between them. It was no longer a space of caution and uncertainty. It was a field of shared memory, a testament to the trust they had forged in the heart of the chaos. The roof of the barn had taken a beating, several shingles torn away by the furious wind. The repair was a two-person job. Colt worked on the roof itself, his movements sure and balanced despite the steep pitch. Marin's job was to climb the tall, rickety ladder, handing him shingles and tools. The cold had settled deep in her bones, and her muscles ached with a profound weariness. Every step up the ladder was a small battle. On one trip, her foot slipped on a damp rung. She cried out, a small, sharp sound, her fingers scrabbling for a hold. Instantly, Colt was at the base of the ladder, his hands a firm, steadying presence on the wooden rails. "Easy," his eyes seemed to say. "I have it." She took a shaky breath and continued her climb. As she neared the top, ready to hand him a fresh bundle of shingles, he reached out to steady her. His fingers brushed against her ankle. It was the same ankle she had bruised in her leap across the flooded creek, and a dark, ugly mark had blossomed there overnight. His touch was feather-light, completely accidental, a fleeting contact of rough, calloused fingertips against her tender skin. But it sent a jolt of surprising, electric warmth shooting up her leg, a warmth that had nothing to do with the weak sun and everything to do with him. It was a heat that pooled in her stomach, chasing away the cold for a moment. She looked down and saw his gaze fixed on the bruise, his expression unreadable, before he looked away and took the shingles from her hand. The moment passed, but the memory of the touch lingered, a small, glowing ember inside her. Later, inside the warm kitchen, the atmosphere was lighter than it had ever been. The storm had washed away more than just the dust. It had rinsed away some of the heavy caution that had defined their interactions. A rich, savory stew simmered on the stove, filling the small house with the scent of beef and root vegetables. Marin was kneading dough for bread, her hands moving in a familiar, comforting rhythm. Colt was at the stove, tasked with seasoning the stew. He took the small tin of salt and, with a furrow of concentration on his brow, attempted to sprinkle a small amount into the pot, but his large, powerful hands, so adept at mending harnesses and wielding an axe, were clumsy with such a delicate task. The lid of the tin slipped, and a cascade of white salt poured into the simmering liquid. His eyes widened in alarm. He shot a quick, almost guilty look at Marin. She had seen the whole thing. A laugh, genuine and unrestrained, bubbled up from her chest. It was a clear, bright sound in the quiet kitchen. Colt's face, for a second, was a mask of consternation. Then, seeing the pure amusement in her eyes, his shoulders relaxed. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug, a gesture that said, "Well, what can you do?" A rare, fleeting twinkle of mischief lit his storm-gray eyes, and he dipped a spoon into the now ruined stew, raised his eyebrows at her, and pretended to consider tasting it. Marin laughed again, shaking her head. "I think we'll have to fish most of that out, Mr. Harrow." He nodded, a faint curve to his lips. The steam from the pot rose around his face, catching in the dark strands of his hair that had fallen across his forehead, softening the hard lines of his face. In that moment, he wasn't the silent, haunted guardian of the ranch. He was just a man who had made a clumsy mistake. sharing a moment of simple, human comedy. The distance between them seemed to shrink, collapsing into the shared, comfortable space of a small, warm kitchen. Ivy, exhausted from the excitement and fear of the previous day, fell asleep not long after the sun went down. She was tucked into her small bed. The faint, sweet smell of pinon blossoms from the soap Maren had used to wash her hair clinging to the air in her little room. The house settled into a deep, peaceful quiet. The only sounds were the soft sigh of the logs in the stove and the gentle ticking of the small mantel clock Maren had found and repaired. Outside, the sky was a vast expanse of black velvet, utterly cloudless, and the Milky Way was a brilliant, shimmering river of light, spilled from one horizon to the other. The stars seemed close enough to touch. Colt sat at the table, cleaning his rifle with slow, methodical movements. The lamplight cast a warm, golden glow on his hands, highlighting the network of scars and calluses that told the story of his life. Maren brewed a pot of chamomile tea, its clean floral scent a calming counterpoint to the lingering aroma of the salvaged stew. She poured a cup and carried it to the table, placing it on the worn wood near his elbow. Her hand brushed against his as she set the mug down. It was another accidental touch, but this time it felt different. It was charged with the memory of the latter, of their shared laughter. The silence that fell between them was not awkward. It was full. It stretched and thickened and became a tangible thing. Maren found she was acutely aware of the sound of her own breathing and of his a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to have deepened slightly. She didn't move away. She stood by the table, her hands clasped in front of her. Colt stopped his work. He slowly, deliberately, set down the cleaning rag and looked up at her. His gaze was direct, unwavering, and the storm was back in his eyes. But it was a different kind of storm now, not one of anger or sorrow, but of a deep, churning uncertainty, of a question he did not know how to ask. Slowly. So slowly she could have stopped him at any time. He lifted his hand. It was not the hand of a man reaching for a tool or a weapon. It was hesitant, almost tender. He reached toward her, and for a heart-stopping second, she thought he would touch her face. Instead, his fingers went to the collar of her dress. "You have a piece of straw." She thought she heard him think, his eyes showing her his intent. With an impossibly gentle touch, his fingertips brushed against the hollow of her throat, retrieving a single, tiny piece of straw that must have fallen from the barn repairs. The brief, warm slide of his skin against hers was an earthquake in miniature. A shiver traced its way down the length of her spine, a purely involuntary response to a touch that was both innocent and profoundly intimate. He pulled his hand back, the tiny piece of straw held between his thumb and forefinger. He did not look away. Maren's heart was a wild bird, beating its wings against the cage of her ribs. This was a threshold, a line drawn in the dust, and they were both standing on it. She could step back. She could return to the safe, careful distance they had maintained, or she could step forward. She took a half-step closer, her lips parted slightly, not in speech, but on a soft, indrawn breath. She did not ask for anything, did not demand, her eyes wide and luminous in the lamplight. Asked a question she didn't know how to speak. He answered, not with a movement toward her, but with a gesture of profound respect. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of the question he saw in her eyes. And then he opened his hands, palms up, on the table. It was a silent offering, a gesture that held no pressure, no expectation. It was an invitation that left the choice, entirely and completely, up to her. She lifted her hand, the one that still tingled from its brief contact with his, and gently, deliberately, placed it in his open palm. His fingers closed around hers, enveloping her hand in a grip that was both strong and gentle. It was an answer more certain than any vow, a silent acceptance. They stood there, connected, so close now that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She could hear the slow, heavy, honest beat of his heart. It was the rhythm of the earth, of steadfastness, of a man who did not lie. He leaned in. The first kiss was as soft as the ghost of the previous night's rain. It was a gentle, questioning touch of his lips to hers, a moment of exploration. Then, as she responded, a slight, answering pressure. The kiss deepened. His other hand came up to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek, the slight rasp of his beard a surprising, pleasant friction against her skin. A deep, slow-burning warmth spread from their joined lips, down through their clasped hands, and into the very core of her being. She could feel the slight tremor in his hand, a testament to the powerful emotions held in check behind his silent exterior. She pulled back just enough to speak, her voice a raw, shaky whisper, a sound that was barely more than a breath. "Please, don't stop." The words hung in the air between them, a plea born not of desperation, but of a clear, certain, and overwhelming desire. It was her choice, her voice, her wish, spoken freely into the warm, safe space he had created. A look of profound, heart-wrenching tenderness softened the hard lines of his face. He answered her plea not with force, but with an almost reverent patience. He kissed her again, a series of slow, lingering kisses that spoke of discovery and appreciation. He rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the cool air. His hand moved from her jaw to the small of her back, his fingers tracing slow, calming circles there, a gesture of reassurance, of safety. He pulled a thick wool blanket from the back of a chair and wrapped it around her shoulders, then drew her into its warmth with him. They stood by the dying embers of the fire for a long time, wrapped together, swaying slightly as if to a silent music. The language between them was one of touch, of breath, of shared warmth. It was an intimacy of profound respect and mutual cherishing, a deep and soulful connection that needed no words. The romance was in the feeling of his heart beating steadily against hers, in the gentle pressure of his hand on her back, in the absolute, unspoken certainty that for the first time in a very long time, they were not alone. Maren leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, outside the small window. A new kind of magic was happening. The first snow of the season had begun to fall, small, white flakes drifting down from the black sky, silent and soft. The cold, harsh world was being covered in a blanket of pure, clean white. Inside the small log house, two people who had been frozen for years by hardship and sorrow stood wrapped in a blanket by a warm fire, and slowly, surely began to thaw. The snow that had fallen in the night was a fragile, temporary peace. It muffled the world, silencing the hard edges of the land, cocooning the small ranch in a soft, white glow. Maren woke to a world reborn, the memory of the previous night a warm ember in her chest. For the first time since arriving in Arizona, she felt a profound, bone-deep sense of belonging. The house was not just a shelter. It was a home. She rose in the quiet, the cold air sharp on her skin. She stirred the embers in the stove, adding fresh kindling, and the smell of coffee soon filled the kitchen. Through the window, she saw Colt by the corral, already at work. He moved against the white landscape, a dark, solid, reassuring figure. The sight of him, the simple fact of his presence, settled something deep inside her. The peace was shattered an hour later. It was not the sound of a single rider. It was the jingle of multiple harnesses, the creak of heavy saddle leather, and the low, confident voices of men who were not trying to be quiet. Maren stepped onto the porch, pulling her shawl tight. Colt was already standing there, his back to her, facing the track. He was motionless, but it was the stillness of a boulder, not a tree. 3 men were riding up, their horses kicking up puffs of clean, white snow. They were not the Rusk brothers. These men wore dark coats and town hats. They looked official. The man in the lead, a portly individual with a waistcoat straining against his middle and a face slick with self-importance, pulled his horse to a halt. He dismounted, leaving the other 2 in their saddles like sentries. "Mr. Harrow," the man said, his voice too loud in the pristine morning. He did not look at Maren. He was addressing Colt as if he expected a reply. "My name is Finney. I'm the land agent for the Hickory Ditch Company." Colt said nothing. He simply waited, his hands loose at his sides. Finney's smile tightened at the lack of response. He reached into a leather satchel and withdrew a folded document. Handling it with a reverence Marin found sickening. "We've come with good news. Harrow, your situation is resolved. The Rusk family has generously agreed to take the lien on your property." Marin stepped forward, her voice cutting through the cold air. "There is no lien on this property." Finney finally turned to her, his eyes the color of muddy water, flicking over her with open dismissal. "Ma'am, this is a private business matter." "I am Mr. Harrow's housekeeper, and I manage his affairs," Marin said, the lie coming easily, tasting like a necessary armor. "What is that document?" Finney's condescending smile returned. "It's a simple transfer of water rights. Ma'am, seems Mr. Harrow here finally saw reason. He signed over the rights to the South Feed yesterday, transferring his allotment to the Rusk family's main holdings. In exchange, they've agreed not to file for foreclosure." "Foreclosure on what?" Marin demanded, her heart beginning a low, cold drumbeat. "On the delinquent taxes and feed bills he apparently owed them," Finney said smoothly. He unfolded the paper. "It's all quite legal. See signed. Sealed." He held it out. Marin took it, her fingers steady. It was an official transfer deed. And at the bottom, in a crude, thick-stroked script, was a signature Colt Harrow. Marin looked at it. The blood in her veins turned to ice. It was a forgery, and a bad one. "He signed this," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Yesterday." "That's right. In town." Colt stepped forward, his eyes blazing. He snatched the paper from her hand, his gaze devouring the words. He looked at the signature, and a low sound, a growl of pure animalistic fury, rumbled in his chest. It was the most terrifying sound Marin had ever heard. "Now, Harrow, no need for—" Finney began, taking a nervous step back. "This is a fraud," Marin said, her voice shaking with a cold rage. "He was not in town yesterday. He was here, with me and Ivy, repairing the barn roof all day." Finney laughed, a short, barking sound. "Ma'am, a wife's testimony is one thing, but a housekeeper's against a notarized document. Then I'd like to see the company ledger," Marin said, holding his gaze. "The original book where this transaction was recorded, and the notary's log as well." Finney's eyes narrowed. He was not used to being challenged. "What does a woman like you know about water rights or ledgers? This is the law. Ma'am, the paper is signed. The rights are transferred. We're here to post the new claim stakes and shut off the head gate to this property." One of the men on horseback behind him uncoiled a rope, a heavy mallet hanging from his saddle. "You will do no such thing," Marin said. She turned and walked back into the house. "Marin," she heard Finney call, his voice losing its smooth edge. "This is a legal action." Colt followed her, his face a mask of thunder. He didn't understand. She walked past him, to the attic ladder. She climbed up, into the cold, dusty darkness, and went straight to the wooden chest. She lifted the lid, her hands moving with purpose. She grabbed the stack of maps. She grabbed the water ledger. She grabbed the charcoal drawings. She returned to the porch, her arms full. The three men were watching, confused. Colt's eyes were fixed on the items in her hands. She didn't speak to Finney. She spoke to Colt, laying the items out on the porch rail, the snow-covered wood their new battlefield. "Colt, what is this?" she asked, unrolling the first map. He looked at her, then at the men. He understood. He was being given a voice. He pointed to the map, then to the ditch. "This is his map," Marin said to Finney, who was watching with growing impatience. "And this is his water log. He has recorded the flow rate, the rainfall, and his work schedule every day for 5 years." She flipped through the pages of the ledger. "You say he signed this in town yesterday. What time?" "Around noon," Finney said, clearly inventing. Marin's finger stabbed the page. "According to this log, at noon yesterday, Mr. Harrow was on the barn roof, patching the storm damage. I was handing him the shingles. And she flipped the page. You say this document was filed with your company last month on the 10th. Finney, seeing his lie about yesterday, had failed, quickly regrouped. The signing was a formality. The filing was on the 10th of September. Yes, that's the legal date. Marin smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression. The 10th of September, Mr. Harrow's log. Hell rock washed dry. Drove herd to high pasture. No water in Hickory Ditch. And here, she pulled out one of the charcoal drawings. It was a sketch of the dry, cracked ditch bed. And at the bottom, in Colt's script, was the date September 10th, 1887. The ditch is dead. Your company received a filing for water rights on a day your own ditch was bone dry. A fact, mister. Harrow recorded. Finney was turning red. A farmer's scribbles mean nothing. Then look at the signature. Marin said. Colt stepped forward. He took the forged document and laid it on the rail. He pulled his own notebook and pencil from his pocket. He turned to a new page and wrote his name, Colt Harrow. He pointed to his signature. The H in Harrow was strong, with a long, decisive tail that swept under the rest of the name. Then he pointed to the forgery. The H was stunted, cramped, the tail short and blunt. He wrote again in his notebook, his pencil strokes sharp and angry. He held it up for Finney to read. My H has a long tail. That paper H is short. Like Rusk, the air went thin. Finney's slick confidence shattered. He knew he was caught, but he was a man of paper, and he retreated behind it. This is absurd, he stammered, snatching the forgery from the rail. A graphological debate on a porch, the filing stands. This is a matter for the sheriff and the judge. You'll be served. Good day, ma'am. He mounted his horse, his movements clumsy in his anger. You'll regret this, Harrow. You can't fight the Hickory Company. They rode off, their horses churning the snow into brown slush. Marin and Colt stood on the porch, the cold air burning their lungs. The threat was no longer a shadow. It was here. Colt, Marin said, her mind racing. We have to go to town, now. He nodded, his jaw set. He saddled the buckboard in silence. Marin bundled a sleepy, confused Ivy into her heaviest coat. They rode to Pinyon Ridge, the world silent and white, but Marin's mind was on fire. They didn't have a lawyer. They had a stack of maps and a stubborn, silent truth. Colt pulled the wagon behind the chapel, out of sight of the main street. I'll be quick, Marin said. She took Ivy by the hand. You stay here. Watch for Murdoch. Colt nodded, his eyes scanning the street. Marin hurried into the small, cold chapel, Ivy's hand in hers. Reverend Pike was at the altar, polishing a brass candlestick. Miss Doyle, he said, surprise coloring his voice. And the child. Is something wrong? Reverend, I need your help, Marin said, her voice low and urgent. You know, Mr. Harrow. You know he is an honest man. Pike looked uncomfortable. He is a quiet man, Miss Doyle. He is being robbed, Marin said flatly. The Rusk family is using the Hickory Ditch Company to steal his water rights, and they've forged his name on a document. They say it was filed last month. Pike's eyes widened. That is a terrible accusation. It's the truth, and I have proof. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket, a copy she had made of the old water allotment notice that Colt had posted on the church's community board a year prior. Reverend, this is the notice of Mr. Harrow's legal claim, the one that was posted here for 6 months. I need you to certify it, with your official dated seal, as a parish record. Miss Doyle, I don't wish to be involved in a dispute between the Rusks and... Reverend, Marin interrupted, her voice hardening. This isn't a dispute. It's a crime, and they are using the law to do it. All I'm asking is for you to verify a fact. This notice was here. Will you stand by that fact, or will you let them steal a man's livelihood because you're afraid? Pike's thin face flushed. He looked at Marin's unflinching gaze, at the small, silent child beside her. He licked his lips, then gave a short, jerky nod. He went to his small desk, unlocked a drawer, and took out a heavy metal embosser and an ink stamp. He adjusted the date, inked it, and pressed it firmly onto her paper. October 20th, 1887. Certified true copy. Reverend T. Pike. Thank you, Reverend, Marin said. Folding the precious document, she turned to leave, and her heart stopped. A large shadow filled the entire doorway, blocking the white light from outside. Sheriff Gabe Murdoch stood there, his duster pushed back to reveal the badge on his vest and the Colt revolver at his hip. Well, Murdoch said, his voice as smooth and cold as oil on steel. Miss Doyle? And the good Reverend? A busy morning for prayer. Sheriff, Marin said, her voice steady. She moved Ivy behind her skirt. I was just on my way out to the Harrow place, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. Mr. Finney of the Hickory Company filed a formal complaint. Seems you and your employer are interfering with a legal property seizure. Obstruction. It's a fraudulent claim. Sheriff, the signature is forged. Murdoch chuckled. A dry, humorless sound. That's a mighty serious claim. Ma'am, one a judge will have to hear. He stepped aside. A mock polite gesture. Luckily for you, you'll get your chance. Preliminary hearing, judge's chambers, tonight, 8 o'clock. Marin felt the blood drain from her face. Tonight, it wasn't a hearing. It was a gallows, a show trial, arranged and decided before they ever set foot in the room. We'll be there, Marin said, her voice barely a whisper. I'm sure you will. His gaze was insolent. 8 o'clock. Marin walked past him, her hand tight on Ivy's, her back rigid. She felt his eyes on her until she was out of the chapel. As she walked toward the wagon, she had to pass the front of the Juniper Saloon. Reeve, Pax, and Lorne were there, leaning against the rail, whittling and spitting tobacco juice into the snow. They saw her, and their lazy arrogance focused into cruel amusement. Well, looky here, Reeve called out, his voice carrying in the still air. It's the mute's bride, going to church praying for rain. Ma'am, 'cause you ain't going to get no water from the ditch. Heard you're going to see the judge, Pax added, nudging his brother. Gonna talk him to death. Marin. Lorne just laughed, a high-pitched, ugly sound. Law don't mean nothing out here, girl. Only thing that matters is what the Rusks want, and they want that Dry Bones Ranch. Marin kept walking. She did not look at them. She lifted Ivy into the wagon, her movements stiff. She climbed up beside Colt, who had watched the entire exchange, his hands gripping the reins so hard his knuckles were white. He was a powder keg, and she knew the only thing keeping him from tearing the Rusk boys apart was the knowledge that it was exactly what they wanted. It would prove him an animal, and they would lose everything. She put her hand on his arm, a small, steadying pressure. He looked at her, the inferno in his eyes banked for a single, terrible second. He turned the wagon and drove them home, the only sound the crunch of the wheels on the fresh snow. Night fell. The clock in the kitchen ticked, each sound a hammer blow, counting down the hours. 7 o'clock. The kitchen table was their war room. Marin lit a second lantern. The maps were spread wide. The ledgers were open. Ivy, exhausted by the day's tension, was fast asleep on her pallet by the warm stove, her cloth rabbit clutched to her chest. We have to be organized, Marin said, more to herself than to him. I will be your voice. I will present the evidence. She took a clean sheet of paper and began to write, her script clear and precise. She wrote out a formal deposition, a timeline of events. Item 1, the forged signature. She detailed the difference in the H. Item 2, the false alibi. She listed their activities on the day of the supposed signing. Item 3, the water log. She detailed the discrepancy of the dry ditch on the day of the filing. Item 4, the certified claim. She placed Reverend Pike's stamped document on the table like an ace. Colt was not idle. He sat opposite her, a piece of charcoal in his hand. He was drawing. He drew the ranch. He drew the headgate. He drew the exact location of the old marker stakes, the ones his father had driven, and compared them to the new, fraudulent stakes the Hickory men must have planted. He was creating visual proof, a map that any judge, honest or not, could understand. They worked in silence, a perfect, focused team. The only sound was the scratch of her pen and the soft, dry scrape of his charcoal. At last, it was done. Marin stacked the papers. It was 7:45. Time to go. She stood up, her body aching with tension. She looked at Colt, who was staring at the finished drawings, his face grim. The lamplight was harsh, carving deep shadows under his eyes. It caught the pale, slick circle of the scar on his throat. She moved to him, her hand lifting. She didn't touch the scar, not directly. She placed her fingertips just beside it, on the warm, living skin of his neck. She didn't have to ask what happened. She didn't have to know the details of the fire or the Rusk family's part in it. She knew the pain. "I hear you," she whispered, her voice thick. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a flicker of old agony. Then he lifted his hand and covered hers, his calloused palm pressing her fingers against his neck. It was not a caress. It was an acknowledgement, a thank you, a promise. "It's time," she said. He nodded. He walked to the pallet and, with a gentleness that broke her heart, he lifted the sleeping Ivy, blanket and all, into his arms. Marin grabbed the lantern and the stack of papers. They stepped out of the warm kitchen into the frigid, moonlit night. The snow crunched under their boots. As they climbed into the buckboard, the sudden noise and movement disturbed the night. From the dark rafters of the barn, a silent explosion of black wings. A flock of crows, startled from their roost, burst into the night air, cawing their displeasure, their dark shapes scattering against the bright, cold moon, and then stared at them, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. A bad omen. Colt clicked his tongue, and the wagon lurched forward, its wheels grinding on the frozen gravel, carrying the three of them toward the light of the town and the waiting trap. The judge's chambers were not chambers at all. They were the back room of the Juniper Saloon. Hastily cleared of poker tables and spittoons, a long, scarred trestle table served as the bench, and a dozen mismatched wooden chairs were arranged for the audience. The air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey, kerosene, and the damp wool of coats steaming in the heat of the two pot-bellied stoves that roared in the corners. It was a room designed for drinking and gambling, not justice, and the atmosphere was heavy with the expectation of a foregone conclusion. Sheriff Gabe Murdoch sat at one end of the table, not as a lawman, but as an overseer. His chair tilted back, his thumbs hooked in his belt. He was radiating a smug, proprietary confidence. This was his town, his process, his outcome. Beside him sat a man in a city suit, a lawyer named Davies, whose papers were stacked in a neat, imposing pile. He was the Rusk family's hired gun, a weapon of ink and clauses. Colt sat on a simple wooden bench, straight-backed and silent. In his arms, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, slept Ivy, oblivious to the quiet war about to be waged for her future. Marin sat beside him, their stack of papers resting on her lap. It looked small and rustic compared to the lawyer's arsenal. The room was crowded. The Rusk brothers Reeve, Pax, and Lorne occupied the front row, their legs stretched out, smirks plastered on their faces. Behind them, a collection of townspeople had gathered, drawn by the scent of a public spectacle. Marin saw Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile, her face pinched with worry, and near the back, the anxious, bird-like profile of Reverend Pike, a portly, balding man who Marin assumed was the circuit judge, banged a small gavel on the table. "This is a preliminary hearing on the matter of a property lien and water rights transfer between the Hickory Ditch Company, representing the interests of the Rusk family, and Mr. Colt Harrow." He nodded to the lawyer. "Mr. Davies, you may begin." Davies rose, a slick performer taking the stage. "Your Honor, Sheriff, citizens, the matter before us is simple. "The defendant, Mr. Harrow," he said, gesturing to Colt without looking at him, "being in significant financial arrears to my clients, did knowingly and legally sign over his water allotment from the Hickory South feed. The document, notarized and filed, is ironclad." He held up the forged deed, the paper trembling slightly in his self-important grip. "This document represents a legal and binding contract. My clients, in an act of community-minded generosity, have agreed to absorb Mr. Harrow's debts in exchange for these rights. We are here simply to enforce this contract and put a stop to the defendant's unlawful obstruction," he droned on. A river of legal jargon heretofore. Whereas, riparian rights designed to muddy the waters and drown the simple truth. He painted Colt as an irresponsible deadbeat and the Rusks as benevolent saviors. Marin felt a cold, clean anger rise within her, burning away the last of her fear. When Davies finally sat down, the judge looked at their bench. "Mr. Harrow, do you have a response?" he asked, the question a cynical formality. Marin stood. Every eye in the room turned to her. Reeve Rusk let out a low, mocking chuckle. "Your Honor," Marin said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the frantic beating of her heart. "My name is Marin Doyle. I manage Mr. Harrow's household and his records. With your permission, I would like to speak on his behalf." The judge exchanged a look with Murdoch. It was irregular, but to deny it would look biased. "Proceed, Miss Doyle, briefly." "Thank you." Marin did not look at her papers. She looked at the judge. "Mr. Davies claims this document is ironclad. I'm here to say it is a fabrication, built on a foundation of lies." Davies shot to his feet. "Objection. The woman is making baseless accusations." "Sit down, Davies." The judge grumbled. "Let her speak." Marin nodded. "The document claims Mr. Harrow signed it in town at the notary's office at noon yesterday. That is the first lie." She laid Colt's water ledger on the table. "This is Mr. Harrow's daily log. At noon yesterday, he was on his barn roof, repairing storm damage. I was with him. The log also details a 5-year history of this property. It shows a deep and abiding care for the land. Not the neglect Mr. Davies suggests." She then laid out Colt's charcoal drawing of the dried ditch. "The document was allegedly filed on September 10th. This is a drawing Mr. Harrow made on that day, showing the hickory ditch bone dry. He was being asked to sign over rights to water that did not exist." Her presentation was crisp, factual, delivered without emotion. She was a gunfighter, and her bullets were dates, times, and recorded observations. She spoke of the flow rates, of the landmark burnt cypress tree that marked the old boundary, all of it cross-referenced in the meticulous log. "And now," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "we come to the signature itself." She took Colt's notebook, where he had written his name, and placed it beside the forged deed. "I ask you to look at the H in Harrow. Mr. Harrow's signature has a long, confident tail. The signature on the deed is short, stunted." She paused, letting the visual evidence sink in. "Furthermore, Mr. Harrow, like many who learn their letters with care, always writes the number 7 with a bar across the middle." She pointed to the date on the deed. "The number 7 on this document has no bar. It is not his hand." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the simple proceeding they had expected. This woman was fighting back, and she was making sense. Davies was on his feet again, his face flushed. "Handwriting analysis from a housekeeper. This is preposterous. The document was notarized." "Then I would like to call a witness to the stand," Marin said calmly. "Reverend Pike." The Reverend looked as if he might faint. He shuffled forward, his hands twisting the brim of his hat. He was sworn in, his voice a nervous squeak. "Reverend," Marin began, her tone gentle. "A year ago, did Mr. Harrow file a public notice of his water claim, as required by territorial law?" "He did," Pike whispered. "And was that notice posted on the community board in your chapel for the required 6 months?" "It was." "And is this she said, holding up the certified document. Its official stamp, a bold declaration. A true copy of that original notice, which I asked you to certify this morning. Mike looked at the Rusks, then at Marin, then at the stamped paper in her hand. He took a deep breath. "It is," he said, his voice finding a sliver of strength. "That is my seal. The original claim is a matter of parish record." Davies was sputtering. But before he could object, Marin said, "I have one more witness, Mrs. Henderson." The owner of the mercantile looked startled, but she walked to the front, her back straight. After being sworn in, she faced the room with a sharp, defiant gaze. "Mrs. Henderson," Marin said. "Mr. Davies's document claims Mr. Harrow was at the notary's office, which is next to your store, around noon yesterday. Did you see Mr. Harrow in town at that time?" Mrs. Henderson sniffed. "I most certainly did not, and I would have. I see everyone who comes and goes on that street. So you did not see him at all yesterday?" "Oh, I saw him," she said, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. "I saw him clear as day, 2 weeks ago, Tuesday, the 6th, around 4 o'clock. He came in for 10 penny nails and a sack of beans, paid in cash." The room was silent. Then, a few people began to whisper. Davies's face had gone from red to a pasty white. He had built his case on a notarized signing, and now he had a credible, unshakable witness placing Colt somewhere else entirely on a different day. The entire timeline was a lie. A clerical error," Davies stammered, shuffling his papers. "The date. The notary must have made a mistake on the date. My client was misinformed." Murdoch saw he was losing control. He slammed the gavel down. "That's enough. This is becoming a circus," he boomed, trying to quell the rising tide of doubt in the room. But it was too late. For the first time, someone had stood up to the Rusks with something other than a gun, and their power, built on fear and intimidation, was showing cracks. The townspeople were leaning forward, their faces a mixture of shock and a dawning, dangerous curiosity. And then, Colt moved. He gently shifted the sleeping Ivy into Marin's arms and stood up. He was a towering figure in the small, crowded room. He walked to the table and picked up a piece of paper and a pencil. Every eye was on him. He wrote 3 words, his script strong and sure. He turned, not to the judge, but to the people of the town. He held up the paper, and then he did something no one in that room had heard him do in years. He opened his mouth, and he forced air past the scarred, ruined tissue of his throat. The sound was a raw, rasping thing, a sound of immense effort and unimaginable pain. It was the sound of a rusty gate being forced open after a decade. "Right," he rasped, the word, a blade of gravel. He took a shuddering breath. Another breath. His whole body tensed with the effort. "Ours." The 3 words fell into a silence so profound it was like a physical blow. It was heavier than any gunshot, more final than any gavel. It was the sound of a man reclaiming his soul. Murdoch stared, his mouth slightly agape. The judge looked from Colt's blazing eyes to the murmuring crowd. He could feel the mood of the room turning against him. To rule for the Rusks now would be too blatant, too corrupt. He cleared his throat, his authority gone. In light of this new testimony, and these discrepancies, this court will postpone its decision pending a full investigation into the matter." He banged his gavel, a weak, hollow sound. Hearing adjourned, it was a retreat, a full, undeniable retreat. Marin stood, her legs trembling, clutching a now stirring Ivy to her chest. Colt came to her side. The Rusk brothers were on their feet, their faces contorted with fury. As Marin and Colt moved to leave, Reeve stepped into their path. His voice was a low, venomous hiss, meant only for them. "This ain't over. Paper and talk is one thing. Enjoy your cows tonight, Harrow. I hear a barn can sing a mighty pretty song when it's lit up, right?" Marin didn't flinch. She looked the young man dead in the eye, her own gaze as cold and hard as frozen steel. "Try it," she said. The words were quiet, but they held the weight of a leveled gun. Reeves' smirk faltered. He saw something in her eyes he had not expected, not fear, but a promise. He stepped back. Marin walked out of the saloon and into the cold, clean night, Ivy's hand now clutching hers. She felt a heavy, warm weight settle on her shoulder. It was Colt's hand. He didn't squeeze or pat, he just rested it there. A silent, public declaration, in front of the entire town, under the cold, watchful eyes of the stars. They were no longer a man, a woman, and a child. They were a family. They were a fortress, and they were ready for the war to come. The night that followed their small victory was a starless, suffocating black. The moon was a ghost, hidden behind a thick veil of clouds, and the air, scrubbed clean by the snow, was preternaturally still. It was this stillness that woke Marin. She lay on her pallet, her senses straining in the dark, and knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that something was wrong. Then she caught it, a faint, alien scent carried on the barely there breeze, weaving through the clean smell of pine and cold earth. It was a greasy, chemical smell, kerosene. She was out of bed in a silent flash, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She didn't call out. She moved to Colt's small room, a dark alcove off the main living space. She could just make out his form, a shadow among shadows on his narrow bed. She reached out and placed a light hand on his shoulder. He did not startle. One moment he was asleep. The next he was awake and utterly still. The transition as seamless as a predator sensing danger. His eyes, already accustomed to the dark, found hers. She didn't need to speak. He had smelled it too. He rose, pulling on his trousers and boots with an economy of motion that was terrifyingly efficient, while he retrieved his rifle from its pegs by the door. Marin moved to Ivy's bedside. She gently shook the small, sleeping form. "Ivy," she whispered, her voice low and calm, forcing the tremor from it. "Wake up, little one. We're going to play a game." The child's eyes fluttered open, clouded with sleep. "A game, a hiding game," Marin said, lifting her from the bed and wrapping her in a thick quilt. "The best hiding spot in the whole world is the root cellar. I want you to go down there and be as quiet as a mouse, and you can take your little wooden flute with you." She pressed the small, simple instrument into Ivy's hand, "And when you feel safe, you can play a little song for the morning to find you." "Can you do that?" Colt was at the door, holding it open just a crack. He looked at Ivy, and his expression, even in the deep shadows, was one of fierce, protective love. He nodded to the child. Ivy, catching the gravity of the moment, didn't cry. She clutched her flute and the quilt and nodded back, her small face serious. Marin led her to the heavy trap door in the corner of the kitchen, lifted it, and helped her down the short, steep ladder into the cool, earthy darkness below. "Be brave, little one," she whispered, and closed the door, sliding a heavy flour sack over it to muffle any sound. When she turned back, Colt was holding out a second rifle to her. It was smaller than his, a Winchester carbine, its stock worn smooth. Her father had taught her to shoot, to hunt for the pot, but she had never aimed a weapon at a man. She took it. The cold, heavy weight of it was a terrible, solid reality in her hands. Colt made two sharp, silent gestures. He pointed to the barn, then made a spreading motion with his hands. "Fire." Then he pointed to the back of the house, toward the small corral gate that opened into the wide, empty pasture. Cattle. She understood. Their plan was a silent, grim ballet. He would fight the fire. She would save the herd. They slipped out the back door, melting into the profound darkness. The smell of kerosene was stronger now, a nauseating promise. They crept along the wall of the house, using the shadows as a shield. They could see them then. 3 wraith-like figures, moving with a furtive, clumsy stealth around the far side of the barn. One was carrying a can. Another was laying a trail of what looked like dry grass from the can to the base of the barn wall. There was a sudden, sharp scratch of a match on stone, a tiny, malevolent star in the blackness. A small flame erupted, and one of the figures touched it to the trail of grass. A line of orange fire raced toward the barn like a burning serpent and hit the dry timber wall with a hungry whoosh. The fire caught instantly, greedily, climbing the old, dry logs, and from inside the barn, the first terrified, guttural bellow of a cow shattered the night. It was a sound of pure panic, and it was answered by another and another, until the night was filled with the drumming, thundering sound of heavy bodies crashing against wood and the raw-throated roars of trapped, terrified animals. It was the signal. Marin broke from the shadows, running low and fast, not toward the fire, but away from it, toward the secondary gate at the back of the corral. The smoke was already thick, acrid in her throat. The heat from the growing blaze was a physical force, pressing against her back. She fumbled with the heavy wooden latch on the gate, her fingers clumsy with cold and fear. At the same time, Colt moved. He was not a man. He was an avenging shadow. He burst from the darkness and charged directly into the heart of the barn. Through the wide main doors, Marin saw him for a split second, silhouetted against the growing inferno inside a black figure against a wall of hellish orange before he disappeared into the smoke. He had grabbed a heavy, water-soaked canvas tarp that was always kept in a barrel by the door, a rudimentary but effective tool against the ever-present threat of prairie fire. She finally wrenched the gate open. "Ha! Get up, go!" she screamed, her voice raw, waving her arms, running at the panicked cattle that were now a churning, terrified mass inside the corral. They saw the opening, the path away from the fire and the suffocating smoke, and they surged toward it. A river of horns and hooves and panicked eyes, they thundered past her, out into the safety of the wide, dark pasture. Just as the last cow cleared the gate, a figure loomed out of the smoke. It was Reeve Rusk, his face a demonic mask in the flickering firelight, his eyes wide with a crazed, vicious excitement. He held a half-empty whiskey bottle by the neck, and he swung it at her head. Marin threw herself back, the bottle whistling past her ear, before he could swing again. A shape exploded from the barn. It was Colt. He must have smothered the main pile of kindling with the tarp and come looking for her. He didn't make a sound. He simply slammed his forearm, wrapped in the thick, wet canvas, into Reeve's swinging arm. There was a sickening, wet crunch. The bottle flew from Reeve's grasp and shattered against the corral fence. Reeve screamed, clutching his arm, a sound of rage and pain. But Marin had no time for him. She felt arms wrap around her from behind, a heavy body pressing her against the gatepost. "Got you now, girl," Pax Rusk hissed in her ear, his breath sour with whiskey. Marin reacted on pure, primal instinct. She drove her heel back, catching him hard on the shin, as he grunted in pain. His grip loosened for a fraction of a second. It was enough. She slammed the back of her head into his face, feeling the crunch of his nose, and drove her elbow hard into his gut. He gasped, stumbling back. She spun, bringing the stock of her rifle around in a short, brutal arc that caught him on the side of the head. He went down in a heap, groaning. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the third brother, Lorne, lunging at Colt's back, a long skinning knife glinting in the firelight. Colt, still tangled with Reeve, seemed to sense the attack. He shoved Reeve away and spun, his movement a blur of impossible speed. He didn't try to block the knife. He caught Lorne's wrist in a grip of iron, twisting it with a sharp, violent motion. The knife clattered to the ground. Lorne cried out as Colt bent his arm back at an unnatural angle, forcing him to his knees. It was in that moment, in that brief, terrible tableau, the fire roaring, one man down, two held at bay, that Marin knew what she had to do. This could not be a secret. Their victory had to be seen. She dropped her rifle, reached into the pocket of her coat, and pulled out the flare gun Colt kept on the mantelpiece for signaling in storms. She pointed it straight up at the black, starless sky and pulled the trigger. There was a loud hiss and a pop, and a ball of brilliant, chemical white light shot into the heavens, where it exploded with a soft thump. It hung there, a temporary, man-made sun, casting a stark, pitiless black and white light over the entire scene. It illuminated the burning barn, the scattered cattle, and the 3 Rusk brothers, caught like rats in a trap. The light seemed to break their nerve. Reeve, cradling his arm, scrambled to his feet. Lorne, freed from Colt's grip, did the same. They grabbed the semi-conscious Pax and began to drag him away. Their retreat a clumsy, panicked scramble into the darkness. In their haste, Reeve stumbled over a coil of rope near the gate. He fell hard, and something heavy and leather slipped from his coat pocket, landing in the dirt. Unseen by him, they disappeared into the night. The flare began to fade, its light sputtering, plunging the world back into the flickering, hellish glow of the fire. And now, there were new sounds. Shouts from the direction of the town, the frantic ringing of the chapel bell. The flare had been seen. Pinyon Ridge was awake. Within minutes, figures appeared, running, carrying lanterns and buckets. Marin saw Reverend Pike, his face pale with alarm, and even Mrs. Henderson, her nightgown flapping, her face a grim mask of determination. A bucket brigade was formed, a frantic, desperate line from the well to the barn. The fire had a strong hold, but the main wall, where it had been set, was now the focus of a dozen buckets of sloshed water. Colt was on the barn roof, a hatchet in his hand, chopping away burning shingles to create a firebreak, his silhouette a heroic figure against the flames. An hour later, the fight was over. The fire was out. The side of the barn was a blackened, steaming, ruined mess. But the structure was still standing. The house was untouched. The herd was safe. The townspeople stood in small, quiet groups, their face smudged with soot, looking from the scorched barn to Marin and Colt. The whispers had already begun. They had seen the kerosene can. They had smelled the whiskey on the air. They knew what this was, as the last of the neighbors began to drift away, their quiet nods and solemn looks a stark contrast to the town's earlier hostility. Marin felt a small tug on her coat. She looked down. Ivy was standing there, her flute clutched in her hand, her face streaked with tears and dirt. She must have crept out when she heard the neighbors arrive. "You won the game," the child whispered. Marin knelt and pulled her into a hug so tight it almost hurt. "We won, little one. We won." Colt slid down from the roof, his face black with soot, his hands raw. He walked over to where Marin was holding Ivy. He knelt in the muddy, ash-strewn dirt, bringing himself down to the child's level. His hands, Marin noticed, were trembling, the adrenaline of the fight finally leaving him. But his eyes, as he looked at the little girl, were softer than she had ever seen them. He reached out and gently wiped a smudge of soot from Ivy's cheek. As he stood, his gaze fell on something on the ground, near the gate where Reeve had fallen. He bent and picked it up. It was the leather pouch. He turned it over in his hand. There, embossed on the flap, was a small, ornate seal, the official seal of the Hickory Ditch Company. He held it out to Marin. It wasn't just a clue. It was a confession, dropped in the dirt. It was the golden thread that tied the legal conspiracy to the violent, physical attack. It was everything. Marin took the pouch, her mind reeling. She leaned against a porch post, the adrenaline leaving her in a rush, replaced by a deep, shuddering exhaustion. She was covered in soot, her knuckles were bleeding, and her body ached. Colt came to her. He stood in front of her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face in the dim, pre-dawn light. Then, he gently took her chin in his hand and tilted her face up. He leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers. It was a gesture more intimate than any kiss. It was a silent acknowledgement of everything they had just been through. It was gratitude. It was a promise. It was a vow, made in the ruins of their small victory, that they would face whatever came next together. In the distance, the chapel bell, which had been ringing frantically, slowed to a single, solemn toll, echoing across the snow-covered valley. The night was over. Pinyon Ridge was awake, and nothing would be the same. The dawn that broke over Pinyon Ridge was the color of a fresh bruise, a tender mix of purple and gray. The air in the kitchen was hazy with steam from the kettle and the lingering, ghostly scent of smoke. The adrenaline of the night had long since ebbed away, leaving behind a deep, trembling exhaustion and the raw, scraped-clean feeling of having survived something terrible. Colt sat at the table while Marin moved around him in the dim light, a silent, efficient ghost. She had a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. She had already tended to the gash on her own knuckles, but now her focus was on him. He had a long, shallow scratch down his forearm where a splintered piece of burning timber had caught him. She knelt beside his chair and began to gently clean the wound. He sat perfectly still, his gaze not on his arm, but on her face, on the dark smudges of soot under her eyes that she hadn't yet washed away, on the small cut on her lip where she'd bitten it in the chaos. He wasn't feeling the sting of the water on his own skin. He was feeling the echo of every danger she had faced. He reached out, his uninjured hand lifting as if to touch her face, but he stopped, his fingers hovering in the air, a testament to his uncertainty. He wasn't afraid of fire or fists, but this fragile, powerful thing between them was a territory he was still learning to navigate. He winced as she dabbed at a particularly raw spot on his arm, and his brow furrowed. But the pain in his eyes was not for himself. It was a deep, aching worry for her. His gaze was 100 unspoken questions, 1,000 silent statements. Are you hurt? Are you afraid? Did they harm you when she finished cleaning the wound? Her hand lingered on his arm. She looked up, and her gaze traveled from his worried eyes to the grim line of his mouth, and then, finally, to the scarred, ravaged skin of his throat, starkly visible in the pale morning light, the brand, the mark of all his old pain. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned forward. It was not an act of passion, but of profound recognition. She pressed her lips to the very center of the scar. The kiss was slow, gentle, and reverent. It was not a kiss of pity for the man he had been, but a kiss of acknowledgement for the man he was. It did not try to heal the old wound. It honored the strength it had taken to survive it. "This," she whispered against his skin, her breath warm on the cool scar tissue, "tells me how brave you are." A shudder went through his powerful frame. He let out a breath, a ragged, unsteady sound, as if her touch had unlocked a pain he had held inside for a decade. He lifted his hand, the one that had hesitated, and this time, he did not stop. His fingers, rough and calloused, gently cupped her jaw, turning her face to his. He looked into her eyes, and she saw the walls he kept so carefully guarded crumble into dust. He leaned in and his lips found hers. This kiss was different from the one before. It was not a question, it was an answer. It was deeper, surer, filled with the desperate, grateful relief of the survivor. His other arm came around her, pulling her from her kneeling position and into the circle of his embrace, drawing her close against the solid, warm wall of his chest. He was holding her as if she were the only anchor in a world that had tried to burn them down. She felt the tremor of emotion that ran through him, and it was her own. Her hands came up to rest on his shoulders, her fingers gripping his shirt. The kiss deepened, a silent, desperate communication of everything they had survived, everything they had become to one another. When he pulled back slightly, his breath warm on her face, she was trembling. "Please," she whispered, the words a familiar, fervent echo of her own heart's deepest truth. "Don't stop." It was a vow she was making, a renewal of her choice. It was not a plea for him to continue the kiss, but a plea for him to never let go of this, of them. It was a request for this new, fragile, beautiful world they were building together to be real, to be lasting. He understood. He lifted her as easily as if she were a child and carried her to the long wooden settee that sat before the cold hearth. He sat down, settling her in his lap, and pulled the heavy wool blanket from the back of the seat, wrapping it around them both, creating a small, warm world for just the two of them. There, in the hazy dawn of the embattled morning, they held each other. The intimacy was not one of hurried passion, but of slow, profound rediscovery. There were long, lingering kisses, punctuated by the simple, miraculous sound of their shared breath. He would run his hand over her hair, his touch infinitely gentle. She would trace the line of his jaw, marveling at the strength she found there. His hand would lift her face to his, and her back would arch slightly, a silent, willing invitation. Every touch was a question, every response a joyful affirmation. It was a conversation of skin and breath, of absolute consent and mutual cherishing, a silent symphony of two souls finding their way home in each other's arms. The sun was just beginning to pour a thin, golden light through the grimy window panes when the exhaustion finally gave way to a quiet, shared smile. They were still wrapped in the blanket, her head resting on his chest. The smell of smoke and kerosene was finally being replaced by the simple, domestic scent of coffee and wood smoke from the newly tended stove. The world outside was still there, with its threats and its dangers, but in this small, warm space, they were safe. Maren lifted her head and touched her forehead to his. "Let's finish this water business today," she said, her voice quiet but filled with a new, unshakable resolve. He looked at her, and his gray eyes were clear and steady. He nodded. The town square was a sea of mud and melting snow. A crowd had gathered, drawn by the news of the fire, which had spread through the small town like a contagion. The atmosphere was different from the night before. The cynical curiosity was gone, replaced by a low, angry murmur. They had seen the scorched barn. They knew what a kerosene fire looked like. This was no accident. Sheriff Murdoch was there, trying to maintain an air of authority, but his face was tight with strain. The Rusk family stood apart, their patriarch, a hard-faced man named Silas, flanked by his 3 disgraced sons. Reeves' arm was in a makeshift sling. Pax's nose was swollen and purple. They were radiating a sullen, defiant anger. Maren walked into the center of the square, Colt at her side. He was not carrying Ivy. The child was safe with Mrs. Henderson, who had insisted. All eyes turned to them. "Sheriff Murdoch," Maren said, her voice carrying in the cold, still air. "Last night, my employer's property was attacked. His barn was set on fire in an attempt to murder his livestock and destroy his home. Now, Miss Doyle," Murdoch began, holding up a hand. "We don't know the cause of the fire. Could have been a stray spark, a lantern. It was arson, Sheriff, and I have proof." She held up the leather pouch. "When the attackers fled, one of them dropped this." She walked to Silas Rusk and held it out. "I believe this belongs to you, or at least to the company you now control." Silas Rusk looked at the Hickory Ditch Company's seal on the pouch as if it were a snake. A wave of whispers went through the crowd. They all recognized the seal. "That proves nothing," Silas snarled. "Anyone could have found that." "Perhaps," Maren agreed. "But it was found at the scene of a crime that happened just hours after your sons threatened Mr. Harrow with fire." "My boys were home with me all night," Silas roared. "Is that so?" A new voice cut through the tension. Reverend Pike stepped forward, a small ledger in his hand. "Because the chapel bell, which I rang to sound the alarm, was rung at precisely 2:15 this morning. I noted the time, as is my custom in my parish log. It took me and the others a good 10 minutes to reach the Harrow Ranch." Another voice, sharp and clear, added to the chorus. "And that's funny," Mrs. Henderson said, pushing her way to the front, her own sales ledger held like a shield. "Because my log shows that Reeve Rusk, right here, bought 2 gallons of kerosene and a box of matches at closing time yesterday. Said he needed it for his lamps." A mighty lot of kerosene for lamps, I thought at the time. The net of truth, woven from a leather pouch, a church bell, and a shopkeeper's ledger, was now tightening around the Rusk family. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, angrier. These were smallholders, ranchers, people who understood the sanctity of a man's property and the terror of a midnight fire. Murdoch could feel the ground shifting under him. The court of public opinion had reached its verdict. His allegiance to the Rusks was now a liability that could cost him his badge. He looked at the hard, unforgiving faces of his constituents, and he made a political calculation. He cleared his throat, his face a mask of reluctant duty. "Silas Rusk," he said, his voice loud and official. "In light of this new evidence and these testimonies, I have no choice. Reeve Pax Lorne Rusk. I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of arson, conspiracy, and attempted destruction of property." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Silas Rusk's face went white with fury. His sons looked at him, their arrogance finally shattered, replaced by a dawning, panicked fear. The judge, who had been hovering at the edge of the crowd, saw his chance to redeem himself. He stepped forward. "And this court," he announced, his voice booming, "hereby dismisses the fraudulent claim made by the Hickory Ditch Company. The water rights of the Harrow Ranch are affirmed and will be protected by the full authority of this territory." A ragged cheer went up from the crowd. It was over. The siege was broken. Colt turned, his back to the chaos of the arrests, and faced the people of the town. He looked at the faces, some still suspicious, but many now filled with a grudging, newfound respect. He reached out and took Marin's hand, his grip firm and sure. He took a deep breath, drawing on a well of strength she had never seen before. He stood tall, and his voice, when it came, was not the raw, painful rasp of the night before. It was stronger, clearer, rough-hewn but resonant, a voice reclaimed from the ashes. He spoke a single word, a word that was a declaration, a verdict, and a promise, loud enough for the entire town square to hear. "Home." The word settled over the crowd, profound and absolute. It was not just about land or water. It was about the woman whose hand he held. Just then, Mrs. Henderson emerged from the mercantile and perched on Colt's broad shoulders. Clapping her small hands in delight was Ivy. She had a smile on her face so wide it seemed to light up the entire square. Marin looked up at the man she loved, at the child who was now her daughter, and tears welled in her eyes. They were not tears of fear, or sorrow, or even relief. They were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. The long, lonely roads of their pasts had finally, miraculously, led them here. They were a family. And they were finally, truly, home. Winter came to Pinyon Ridge not as a conqueror, but as a peacemaker. It laid a soft, forgiving blanket of white over the hard, red earth, muffling the world in a profound and gentle quiet. The raw scars on the land and on the people were softened, smoothed over by the patient, healing hand of the cold. The air, once thick with dust and suspicion, was now crisp, clean, and thin, each breath a sharp, clarifying gift. At the Harrow Ranch, the season brought not hardship, but a quiet, joyful settling. The scorched timbers of the barn were a dark memory against the new-fallen snow, a testament to a battle fought and won, hanging proudly over the front door. On a nail Colt had driven deep into the lintel was an old, rusted horseshoe he had found half buried in the creek bed. Ivy, in a solemn ceremony of her own invention, had tied a single, bright red ribbon to its curve. It was, she declared, for luck. And looking at it, Marin and Colt found that they believed her. It was a small, bright flag of hope against the vast, white world. Their first task as a family, as a unit forged in fire and flood, was to rebuild. They did not hire help from the town, though Marin suspected some would have offered it now. This was work they had to do themselves. They rode the buckboard into the high country, where Colt, with the practiced eye of a man who knew the language of wood, selected and felled 2 sturdy lodgepole pines. He worked with a silent, rhythmic efficiency, the clean, sharp sound of his axe ringing in the cold, still air. Together, they wrestled the heavy logs into place, spanning the torrent-carved gap of Hellrock Wash. It was hard, punishing work. Marin's muscles screamed in protest, and her hands, already calloused, grew raw, but she worked alongside him, her movements mirroring his, a silent dance of shared effort. He would set a brace. She would hammer the peg. She would hold a rope taut. He would cinch the knot. When the new bridge was finished, solid and secure, they stood on it for a long moment, not speaking. Below them, the creek, now fed by the slow, steady melt of the high snows, flowed clear and gentle. Its soft, gurgling sound was no longer the roar of a monster, but a peaceful, constant music. It was the sound of life returning, the sound of their home's heartbeat. The house itself began to change. It was no longer just a shelter. It was slowly becoming a reflection of the people within it. One cold afternoon, using planks of scrap lumber from the barn repairs, Maren built a small, simple bookshelf beside the hearth. It was crooked, and the shelves were not quite level, but to her, it was the most beautiful piece of furniture in the world. She spent the long, dark evenings at the kitchen table, the lantern casting a warm, golden circle of light. With a pot of ink and a stack of cheap paper, she began to write. She wrote down the stories her mother had told her as a child, tales of clever foxes and brave princesses, of mischievous river spirits and the man in the moon. Her handwriting was neat and careful, a legacy being transcribed from memory onto the page. Colt would sit opposite her, a piece of charcoal in his hand. While she wrote the words, he gave them life. He drew the characters for her stories on the covers she fashioned from stiff card. His drawings were simple, but they were filled with a surprising, tender character. The fox had a knowing glint in its eye, the princess a stubborn set to her jaw. Ivy would sit between them, her small face a mask of intense concentration, her finger tracing the shapes of the letters Maren wrote. B, she would whisper, her breath fogging in the cool air. Brave. Then she would point to Colt's drawing on the cover. Princess, she would say, a note of triumph in her voice. One day, she took the charcoal from Colt's fingers, and on a piece of scrap wood, she drew a shaky, lopsided circle with 2 dots and a smiling line. She pointed to it, then pointed to her own chest. Ivy, she said, her first written word. Colt had looked at Maren over the child's head, and the shared look of quiet, profound pride that passed between them was more binding than any spoken vow. Their quiet life was punctuated by the occasional visitor. The fear that had once isolated the ranch had been replaced by a grudging, then a genuine, respect, Mrs. Henderson would sometimes ride out with a fresh-baked pie, her sharp eyes softening as she watched Ivy read from one of the handmade books. One afternoon, as the snow fell in thick, silent flakes, Reverend Pike arrived on his mule. He did not come inside, but stood on the porch, stamping the snow from his boots, his hat in his hands. Maren offered him coffee, but he politely declined. I didn't come to preach. Miss Doyle, he said, his gaze taking in the scene within the warm, fire-lit room, the child's drawing tacked to the wall, Colt mending a small pair of boots by the hearth. He smiled, a tired but genuine expression. I came to see something I should have seen a long time ago. He looked from Maren to Colt, who had paused in his work, watching him. In town, people talk, the Reverend said quietly. They ask me, when is the wedding? When will you make it official? He shook his head slowly. I told them what I believe to be the truth. Ceremony is what people do when their hearts are not yet sure. It's a public promise to convince themselves as much as anyone else. He looked back into the warm, quiet room. Here, he said, his voice soft with a newfound wisdom. The hearts have already chosen. This house is already blessed. Colt looked at Maren, and she looked back at him. They didn't need a church. They didn't need a piece of paper from the territorial government. They had this. They simply nodded at the Reverend, a shared, silent acknowledgement of the truth he had spoken. He tipped his hat, turned, and rode away through the falling snow, leaving them to the quiet sanctity of the life they had built. That night, they had their wedding feast. It was a celebration for an audience of 2. Maren roasted a wild grouse Colt had brought home, and she made a fresh batch of cornbread, its warm, sweet smell filling the house. They sat at the small kitchen table, the one he had drawn for her in the ash so long ago. Ivy was fast asleep, dreaming of brave princesses, They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. They ate, and their eyes met over the flickering candlelight. His gaze was steady, filled with a quiet, unconditional love that made her feel seen, truly seen. For the first time in her life, she would smile, and he would return it with that small, hesitant curve of his lips that still made her heart ache. They raised their simple tin cups, filled with sweet, hot tea, and touched them together with a soft, dull clink. It was a silent toast, to survival, to trust, to the future, to staying. After they had cleaned up, they stepped out onto the porch. The snow had stopped, and the world was a pristine, unbroken landscape of white under a sky full of sharp, cold stars. The air was so still it seemed to hum. It was cold, a deep, penetrating cold that promised the heart of winter. Colt went back inside for a moment and returned with the heavy canvas coat, the one he had given her on her first day. He draped it over her shoulders, his hands lingering there for a moment. It was the same gesture, the same promise, but it meant so much more now. It was not just a promise of shelter, but of a shared life. It was a silent renewal of the vow he had made in a scrawled note, safe. Maren leaned back against his solid frame, her head resting on his shoulder. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against her back. She turned her head, her lips close to his ear, and whispered words meant only for him. A quiet litany of thanks, of hope, of a future she now dared to believe in. He listened, and when she was finished, he turned her to face him. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. His kiss, when it came, was not the searching, uncertain kiss of their first real embrace, nor the desperate, grateful kiss after the fire. This was a kiss that was mature, sure and deeply, wonderfully warm. It was a kiss that held no questions, only answers. It held the quiet promise of 1,000 nights just like this one. He held her for a long time, there on the porch, two small, warm figures in a vast, cold, and beautiful world. Then he led her inside, closing the door softly behind them, shutting out the cold and the night. The next morning, the world was born anew. The sounds of their new life filled the air, the rhythmic rasp of Colt's saw as he cut firewood, the bright, clear sound of Ivy's laughter as she built a small snowman near the porch, the warm, comforting smell of Maren's cornbread baking in the oven. Their life was not a grand, dramatic story anymore. It was a collection of small, precious, ordinary moments. Their love was not a dazzling, short-lived firework, destined to explode and fade. It was a steady, quiet hearth, built to warm them for the rest of their days. That afternoon, while Colt and Ivy were out checking the herd, Maren climbed to the attic. She opened the old wooden chest, the one that held the ghosts of Colt's past. She took out a single sheet of clean paper. She was not writing to a mother she had lost, or to a future she feared. She was writing to herself. She dipped the pen in the ink and wrote, "I remember the day I whispered, 'Please, don't stop.' I thought then that I was only talking about a kiss. I was a fool. I was speaking to this life, to this house, to the man who had learned to speak with his hands and his heart because the world had tried to steal his voice. I was asking for all of it. The hardship, the joy, the fear, the fight. I was asking for the chance to build a home, and he, in his quiet, steady, magnificent way, he answered." She folded the letter and placed it at the very bottom of the chest, not with the ghosts of his past, but as the first testament of their future. The final image was not one of closure, but of a journey just beginning, a wide shot of the prairie, covered in a thin, perfect layer of snow. From the porch of the small log house, 3 sets of footprints, one large and long striding, one smaller and lighter, and one, a tiny, happy trail of hops and skips led out across the white expanse, parallel, together, heading west toward the setting sun. The smoke from the chimney rose straight and true into the cold, still air, and there, carved deep into the main beam of the porch roof, was a single, rough-hewn word, home, and beneath it, newly added, were 3 names, also carved by a steady, loving hand Colt. Marin Ivy. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to share your location and your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us